All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. In a world filled with questions about our past, our origins, and the mysteries of creation, one truth still stands firm. I'm your host, Donny Budinsky, and tonight we take on a question that has fascinated both believers and skeptics alike. What does the Bible say about dinosaurs and dragons? To help uncover the answers, I'm joined by none other than Bodie Hodge. Together, we'll dig deep into history, scripture, and science to reveal insights that may just surprise you and challenge everything you thought you knew. This is more than just a program, it's a journey into the heart of biblical creation, and it begins right now. Bodie Hodge, it is great to have you here, brother, for today's program. How are you doing tonight?
Doing all right. It's a blessing to be on.
Well, it's great to have you here. It's your first time here on the Standing for Truth platform, so we will make sure to give you a good experience, brother. Before we get into your talk, what I'll do is give you a formal introduction for anybody who might be unfamiliar with who you are. Mr. Bodie Hodge attended Southern Illinois University at Carbondale and received a BS and MS in mechanical engineering. His specialty was a subset of mechanical engineering based in advanced materials processing, particularly starting powders. Currently, Bodie runs Biblical Authority Ministries. He is the author of The Fall of Satan, co-author of Dragons, Legends, and Lore of Dinosaurs, and How Do We Know the Bible is True, and co-editor of the Big Book of History. And so, in other words, Bodie, you are well equipped to be discussing and presenting on tonight's topic. And so I think we'll just get right into it. I'm excited for this. I know the audience is as well. And so whenever you're ready, we can get your slides up on the screen and get into the fun, brother.
Sounds good to me. Let's see if I can find the right button here. What am I missing? Here we go. For some reason, it kicked me out. Just give me a moment and I'll get it right back up.
Bodie, take your time. I'll let the audience know as we are doing this live. Anybody that joins us, we will be doing a Q&A period at the end of Bodie's presentation on dinosaurs, dragons, and the Bible. And so if you got a question or a challenge, feel free to send those in. Tag me at Donny or Standing for Truth. That way I don't miss your question. And we'll have some fun interacting with your questions and comments. Did you want to run through the screen share again, Bodie, just to kind of...
Yeah, I'm doing that right now because for some reason it just didn't like me. Technology, it hates me. All right, so in theory, I should be there. Can you see me?
Yes, yes, I can see your slides. Currently, it says Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible.
There we go.
We've got it full screen.
All right, beautiful. All right, well, let me hide this down here and I'll get started.
Okay, Bodie, the floor is yours. I'm looking forward to this.
All right, Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible. This has been one of my favorite subjects for years and years. As a kid, I love dinosaurs. I love the subject of dragons, and, when it comes to things like Lord of the Rings, you see dragons on there and so forth. I really enjoy that topic. And of course, as a Christian, I love to step back and start with God and his word to look at all aspects of reality. And that includes dinosaurs. Of course, that includes dragons. So let's dive into this subject in a little bit more detail. Now, I like to have fun. So hopefully you guys like to have fun. Here's a cartoon done by Dan Leith. He's a brilliant guy, actually. He says, talking about Jonah here, when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they were the ones who did the eating. When Jonah disobeyed God, so sometimes you have to step back like, oh, yeah, okay, the world changed a lot with Adam and Eve. But, we are in a culture that talks a lot about dinosaurs, talks a lot about dragons, and we want to go back to creation. We want to see, how does this relate to people like Adam and Eve? How does it relate to the world that God originally created? And now we're in a sin, cursed, and broken world. How does everything affect? And so, we want to dive into that subject. But guess what? the world talks about that too. The world talks an awful lot about dinosaurs. In fact, here's just a handful of kids' books on dinosaurs. And I mean, this is just a start. There's so many out there, it's tough to believe. But these books do not give a biblical view of dinosaurs. Instead, they've set the Bible aside, they put it out of the way, and they just start with the world's ideas to look at dinosaurs. And I would suggest the world using, whether it's secular media, whether it's these books and so forth, they're using dinosaurs to draw kids into the next generation to kind of move over to the secular worldview. It's kind of a gotcha kind of a thing. And I don't say this lightly because this happened to me. When I was a kid, I actually got this book from the Scholastic Club. I bought it for, just a matter of cents. It was so cheap back in those days. But to me, that book, it was a book on dinosaurs. And to me, that was the gospel truth on dinosaurs. I still remember that book. I still have that book, actually. It's a little book. It's only got 20 some pages in it, but it starts off, very first line is millions of years ago. And, by the time I get to the end of the book, the last dinosaur died because it got caught in a tree. So that's just what I was taught. But to me, growing up as an impressionable child, that really influenced me. It really did mess with me. So obviously, the world doesn't teach a biblical view of dinosaurs. So what exactly does the world teach? Here, let me put a quote up here. This is from secular people. Look what they say here. Because birds are dinosaurs, you see, they say because birds are dinosaurs, they equate birds and dinosaurs today. They say dinosaurs haven't died out because when you look out there and you see hummingbirds, or you see goldfinches or whatever's flying around out in your yard, they say, look, those are dinosaurs. Those are the descendants of dinosaurs. And the world teaches this as though it's some sort of matter of fact. Now, I don't want to look at this and say, hey, let's just take what the world says and go from there. No, let's step back and let's analyze this kind of thing biblically. But see, the mind of the unbeliever, the mind of the world, by and large out there, is caught up in the secular humanistic worldview. Now, let me explain that for just a moment. They don't believe the Bible. They're not following God and his word. They've rejected that God created everything in 6 days and rested on the seventh and so forth. Instead, they've replaced that history with a false history that says everything came from nothing. That's really what Big Bang is. They say this happened 13 to 15 billion years ago. They say there was nothing, no time, no space, nothing at all. Something pops into existence from nothing and rapidly explodes or expands. That's called the Big Bang. As the story goes, you get stars about 10 billion years ago, the sun about 5 billion years ago. They say the earth was molten about 4.5 billion years ago. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.8 billion years ago, they say you get the first oceans. And then through random processes, chemicals come together and form the first life. And it evolves further and further to where you see some dinosaurs on my head. Okay, those are just lorikeets. Those are actually wild lorikeets down in Australia. My wife is from Australia, and we've been down there a number of times, and we'd feed these lorikeets the sugar water, and I loved it. This was the very first trip I ever went down there. It was amazing. I loved it. If you ever get a chance to feed the lorikeets, do it. It's awesome, but take an extra shirt. Yeah, I made that mistake. I didn't do it. It was gross all day long, but at any rate, that's the way the world is looking at dinosaurs. They're thinking in terms of Big Bang, millions of years, evolutionary ideas when they look at dinosaurs. And I would suggest a lot of those kids' books, a lot of the media that's out there surrounding dinosaurs is teaching the same sort of thing. They're teaching this secular humanistic origins account, and it's dead false when you start with God and his word. So if we're going to look at the subject of dinosaurs in a little bit more detail, we need to know what the definition of a dinosaur is. A dinosaur, by technical definition, is a reptilian land creature that has one of two hip structures so that it raises its body up off the ground. So when you look at something like a Komodo dragon here, a crocodile, or an alligator, by technical definition, they are not a dinosaur because their legs come out to the side. So it's more sprawling type of a hip. And so their body naturally rests on the ground. So they're not technically dinosaurs. Now, these other two that stand upright, kind of on the right side of your screen as you're looking at it, they stand upright, whether it's a four-legged or whether it's a two-legged dinosaur, those would technically be dinosaurs. Now, think of this definition with something like a flying reptile, like, say, a pteranodon or a pterodactyl. By technical definition, they're not dinosaurs. Neither is this plesiosaur down on your lower left. Instead, that is a water reptile. Now, a lot of times in a layman's sense, we lump those in with the dinosaurs, but technically they're not dinosaurs. Now, this sauropod in the upper right or this baby T-Rex in the lower right side, those are dinosaurs by the technical definition. So here's an interesting question that will keep us going. Does the church, by and large, across the country, in fact, around the world, do they teach a biblical view of dinosaurs? Now, there are some, and I appreciate that, and I absolutely love that. But a lot of churches don't. A lot of churches don't even talk about the subject. They just go about their business talking about other stuff. They just don't talk about dinosaurs. There are some Christians that teach things like this. This is from a Christian. He says, these large and a few small reptile species appear to have dominated Earth's land and sea life from 250 million to 65 million years ago. Their creation probably belongs to the fifth creation day. Here's another. This is another old Earth Christian. He says, God made the reptiles, including dinosaurs, beginning about 230 million years ago. Now, when I saw these quotes for the first time, I remember, I was studying the subject of dinosaurs, and I looked at this and I was like, really what they're teaching, they're just teaching the secular view of dinosaurs. Now, they may not agree with the evolutionary aspects and so forth, and have some nuance and differences, but the geological evolution is definitely there. So there are some huge problems with this sort of thing. So when we step back and look at this, and we're going to say, okay, let's look at dinosaurs then. Let's think in terms of what the Bible teaches. I've got my Bible right here. And so I want to go back to the Bible, and I want to look, starting from the very first verse, at the subject of dinosaurs. And I want to use God as the absolute authority on that subject, because let's face it, there is no greater authority than God. God is the absolute authority on every single subject, including the subject of dinosaurs, or 6 days, or a global flood, or the Tower of Babel, or whatever subject it might be. God is the absolute authority. But remember what the world's done. The world has rejected God and his word. They throw the Bible out. And so by default, man becomes that authority. So that's the battle. It is a battle over two different authorities. Either God is the authority or man is the authority. Now, let's face it, there is no greater authority than God. So as soon as you try to throw God out and you try to elevate yourself to be greater than God or equal to God, you've committed a fallacy. That is a faulty appeal to authority fallacy. It's fallacious right from the start. But that's what the world's doing. They've rejected God, accepted man as the ultimate authority, and they've tried to redefine history and put an entirely different historical view to dinosaurs. And it's a false view. But what happens then, because there's two different authorities, this is technically two different religions. I was involved in a World Religions and Cults book series. We had over 60 world religions and cults. We worked with experts from 5 continents to write and review that book series. It's an amazing book series, simply called World Religions and Cults. And in there, we actually point out something that's just fascinating. When we start that book series off, we say there's only 2 religions in the world. Don't be confused, there's just 2. Gods and not gods. You see? God is the authority or man is the authority. Christianity versus humanism. All other religions, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's animism or Satanism, or whether it's an evolutionary and atheistic type of a religion, they're all based on man's ideas. They're just different subsets of the religion of humanism. It is a battle over 2 different religions. And so what gets me is when many Christians say, but maybe we can come over and take some of this humanistic religion, particularly some of this stuff that they say happened in Origins, and bring it over and mix it with our Christianity. You see, that's what's happening. People are trying to mix these 2 religions, but I want you to understand they are distinctly different. Like when we start with God and his word, God created everything in 6 days, resting on the 7th. That's not a problem for an all-powerful God. That's all too easy. That's a basis for our work week, by the way. And then we have a perfect creation because God is a perfect God. And then we see the fall of man into sin. And death comes into the world. There's suffering, and that's the world we're living in. That's why we need a Savior in Jesus Christ to save us from sin and death. And then we have the flood of Noah's day, which rearranged continents and laid down the vast majority of rock layers that contain fossils. Of course, we've had some fossil layers since that time, but most are from the flood. Now, that's in stark contrast to this humanistic worldview. Now, the dominant humanistic worldview here in the Western world now is the secular forms of humanism. That's where Big Bang, millions of years, evolutionary ideas come from. Those are subsets or tenets of the religion of secular humanism. And so when Christians say, hey, but let's go over here and let's borrow the Big Bang, or let's go over and borrow from millions of years or evolutionary ideas and try to mix the 2 together, you run into all sorts of problems. They do not mix. Secular humanism does not mix with Christianity. Atheism does not mix with Christianity. Naturalism, when people say they're not religious, that's actually a religious position. Trying to take any of those ideas and mix with the Bible make no sense. Materialism mixing with Christianity doesn't make any sense. And yet Christians do that. And when they mix the two, something has to give. And usually what they give up the pages of scripture. They say, oh, well, maybe a day doesn't mean a day. Maybe those evenings and mornings, they're not really evenings and mornings. Maybe, Adam, was evolved from some sort of ape-like creature, group of ape-like creatures. The sad part is people start teaching those sorts of things and they're reinterpreting Genesis in light of a secular, made-up story about the past. We shouldn't do that. What we need to do is get back to God and his word. And when we get back to God and his word, it makes sense of all aspects of reality, even dinosaurs. So let's take a look at some pretty popular questions about dinosaurs. And let's go back to the Bible and let's see how we answer those types of questions. Here's an easy one. This will get us started. What day did God make T-Rex? Remember, God created everything in 6 days. What day did he make T-Rex? Let's think about this for a second. T-Rex is a land animal. We've seen its footprints on land. It seems pretty well designed to be a land creature. Might have been semi-aquatic. I know some people talk about that sort of thing, but by and large, it was considered a land creature. Now, if we go back to the Bible, God made the beasts of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. This is part of the 6th day of creation. That's the day that God made land animals. So T-Rex is a land animal. Land animals and man were both created on day 6. So what day was T-Rex made? T-Rex was made on day 6. You see how we follow through on that? Just logically. All right, here's another question. What do we think that T-Rex originally ate? That's an interesting question. When I give this talk live, I love to ask this question of kids. A lot of times there's a kid that's like, oh, but look at that T-Rex. Those big teeth. He's eating meat. They're so confident, right? We look at these images, of T-Rex. We don't know exactly, how T-Rex looked. We're looking at bone structures. We got some skin imprints and so forth. So there's still some guesswork in there. There's those little arms. What do they use those arms for? But at any rate, it does have some sharp teeth. It's got some claws and so forth in here. And a lot of people automatically thought it ate meat. And you know what? When we look in the fossil record, there were some T-Rexes that did eat meat. Sue, one of the most famous ones, they actually had stomach contents that were found with it. And in those stomach contents, it had eaten 2 other little juvenile dinosaurs. So at some point, T-Rex did start to eat meat. But originally, I'm asking the question, originally, what did T-Rex eat? And, like I said, those kids want to throw out there, hey, ate meat. Well, let's go back to the Bible. Let's see what the Bible says. Because if we look at the Bible, you're going to get an entirely different answer. So Genesis 1, verse 30, also to every beast of the earth and to every bird of the air and to everything that creeps on the earth in which there's life, I've given every green herb for food, and it was so. So originally that T-Rex was a vegetarian. He was eating things like watermelons and stuff like that. But, he was not eating other animals. And that makes sense. God is a God of life. He made a world full of life, not a world full of death. There was no death. That's what we expected from a perfect God of life. And so he provided vegetation for animals to eat, as well as for man. And of course, all that changed when Adam and Eve sinned against God. And this is from an old children's book, but I like to use this just to let people understand something significant. I don't know how many times I've seen little children's books and children's Bibles that say Adam and Eve ate an apple. It wasn't an apple. It was a real fruit, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, what did that fruit look like? We have no idea. But I love the way it's drawn in here. Doesn't this look like a hand grenade? Boom. Of course, that changes everything. But when Adam and Eve sinned against God, it did change everything. God cursed the ground. He cursed the animals. He sentenced man to die. The world went from a perfect state to now a broken state. And that's the world we live in. The entire dominion of man fell as a result of man's sin. I've had people, though, they ask a really good question. They say, hold on a second. When we actually go out here and look at these different animals, a lot of these animals have what we call defense or attack structures. For example, a turtle has a shell to help protect itself from being eaten. Then you see the talons on an eagle seem very well designed to go out and grab a rabbit or a fish out of the sea. You see the teeth on this alligator and you go, oh boy. These things seem very well designed to go out and kill and eat other things or protect itself from being eaten. So what's a biblical answer to that? And that's actually a very clever question that people ask. There's actually 2 different responses to this that both, originate and when you start with the Bible. The first is that the original design was used to eat vegetarian foods. In other words, it was used for a different purpose. For example, that T Rex could use those sharp teeth that just tear through your watermelon patch. There they go, that quick. Boom, they're gone. If you think about some of the other animals that eat meat, cats, for example, can have a diet that's almost 100% meat. And yet they've documented a couple of lions that refuse to eat meat. One of them over here in a reserve, all it would eat was spaghetti. So get that rabbit out of here. Get my spaghetti. That's all it really wanted to eat. So that doesn't mean that all these animals were originally meat eaters. They were not. When we start with the Bible, they were vegetarian, and that their diet has now shifted. It switched as a result of Genesis chapter 3. Pandas, they have very sharp teeth. Because I've had people say, hold it, they got sharp teeth. They would be meat eaters, right? No, but they're not. Just because they have sharp teeth doesn't mean that they're eating meat. They use their sharp teeth to rip through bamboo, for example. Squirrels, very, very sharp teeth. I've actually been bit by a squirrel one time, and their claws are vicious. Don't ever grab them; they're cute, but boy, they can fight if they really want to. But notice how they use those claws and those teeth for an entirely different purpose. They climb trees, they hold nuts, and so forth. So that's one of the possibilities. The other is there may have been some design changes at the fall of man. When Adam and Eve sinned against God, everything changed. The world changed. Remember, the ground was cursed. Animals were cursed. The serpent itself was cursed above the other animals. Genesis 3:14. Because you've done this, you are cursed more than all cattle and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. Most commentators think this serpent physically changed forms to be at a lower position. Now, how did that change everything else? It says here the cattle and the beasts, they were also cursed. Is that when sharp teeth, claws, things like that came about? I mean, it's possible. Look at the parallel things going on here. You see, the serpent was cursed. To the woman, to Eve, there's increased pain and sorrows in childbearing. To the man, the ground was cursed. Both thorns and thistles came forth to the vegetation. So there's a physical change going on here. Is this when sharp teeth, claws, things like that came about? It is definitely possible. I would leave that option open for sure. In fact, it could be a combination between the two, and there might even be some variations in some of these models. I know there are some really fine-tuned aspects to some of these models as well. Here's a question. I used to get this question all the time. Were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark? Oh boy, did I get this question all the time. What's interesting, though, is when the Ark encounter actually opened, and people could walk through the ark, they'd see dinosaurs on there. So now, this question doesn't pop up near as much. It does in certain places. But yeah, dinosaurs would have been on Noah's Ark. I want you to understand that, for 1,656 years, which is the time between creation and the flood, yeah, animals were reproducing, they're having others and so forth. But when it came time for the flood, two of every kind came to Noah. God brought them to Noah to keep them alive. So at least two of each kind were on board the ark, two of every kind of the dinosaurs, that is. Of course, there were 7 of some of the clean animals and so forth. So you have to understand, but the dinosaurs were never considered clean type of creatures, even though that distinction did exist in those days. How many different kinds of dinosaurs need to be on Noah's Ark? Now, this is more of a specific question, and I like this one. For a long time, creationists would say there was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50 different kinds of dinosaurs. Now, that was a rough estimate, and people were kind of guessing based on family levels and so forth. But then at the same time, we're kind of relying on the secular world to understand what a family is, with regards to extinct creatures. Just to give you an idea, when we're talking about kinds, a kind isn't necessarily the same thing as a species by today's modern definition. A rough estimate of what a kind is if animals can interbreed with each other, they're part of the same kind. For example, there's a dog kind, there's a cat kind, there's an elephant kind, there's a horse kind, and so forth. When it comes to, say, the horse kind, it includes zebras, it includes some of the wild horses and so forth, includes ponies. When it comes to dogs, you have several different wolf species and coyote species, dingoes. Domestic dogs are all considered one species, but those are all part of the one dog kind. Noah only required 2 dogs, for example, on the ark. All the dogs we have today all over the world are the descendants of those 2 dogs. So if we think about this with regards to all these dinosaurs and so forth, we expect to see variation in the dinosaurs as well, because we see variations within these dogs. And of course, there's 1,600 years or so, there should be some variation. But back to the dog kind, I want you to understand these are not evolutionary changes. Sometimes people say, oh, but we see changes in the dogs. These are evolutionary changes, therefore evolution might be true. No, it's not. If you look at carefully here at, say, the dingoes have lost information for long hair. Collies have lost the information for short hair. It is a filtering process. They're all still dogs. They're just variations in dogs. Longer snouts, shorter snouts, longer hair, shorter hair, and so forth. Chihuahuas have just lost a lot of information altogether. Poor little Chihuahuas. But yeah, at any rate, we do see variations within that dog kind. We see variations within the cat kind or the horse kind or the elephant kind. Same sort of thing is happening with the dinosaur kinds. Now, difference with the dinosaur kinds is we don't see them alive anymore. We think they're all extinct. We can't find any. And so when we look at these types of creatures, especially from the fossil record, we do see some variation. And so, we just kind of have to look at them what's called a cognitum level and see, hey, are these all part of the same family, a part of that same ceratopsian kind? They likely are. They're just the variations in the same way you see variations in the dog. So whether it's a Torosaurus, Penosaurus, Triceratops, and so forth, these are just variations within the ceratopsian kind of dinosaur. Same sort of thing with the sauropods. A lot of these long neck, long tail type of dinosaurs, a lot of these may well be part of the same dinosaur kind, that sauropod kind. We can't always tell because, well, like I said, a good rule of thumb is if they can interbreed together. But since they're not here, we can't see them interbreeding. So, you always have to throw out that little caveat, but most likely these are all part and parcel of the same kind. So if you think about that, then how many different kinds of dinosaurs needed to be on Noah's Ark? Well, people have done some estimates. Remember, originally there was about 50 different kinds. When the Ark Encounter released their statistics, they actually tried to maximize this just a little bit, and their maximum number came out at 85 kinds. And when we talked to the researchers, we said, well, what about the minimum? What would the minimum be? And that's usually not published as much, but the minimum was 36. So it's interesting that that 50 number was actually right in the middle of that. But what this does is it translates to anywhere from about 72 individuals to 170 individuals on board the Ark. And just so you know, they easily fit on board the Ark. You don't need to take the gigantic ones. You take the smaller ones, the juveniles, they easily fit. It's actually a very small footprint of the Ark. What happened to the dinosaurs during the flood that were not on Noah's Ark? Now, this is an easy answer. Everybody knows what happens. If they weren't on the Ark, they died. That's what the Bible says, of course, if you go back and look at Scripture. And old kids' books, you can have some fun with this. There they are, dead, feet up in the air. Kids' books, you got to love it. But, we look around the world, we see these massive dinosaur graveyards. It's not just dinosaurs, it's mixed in with fish and all sorts of other creatures too. It's clearly a marine catastrophe that overtook the land and buried all these creatures. We see a lot of footprints heading in certain directions, dinosaurs and other creatures. And then finally you get to the areas where there was nothing left and they were buried and washed into place. And so we find these massive dinosaur graveyards. But when we look at dinosaur bones, we do not find dinosaurs have little tags on it say, hey, look, I'm 65 or 66 million years old. No, we don't find anything like that. So where exactly does the age of a dinosaur bone come from? Well, let me explain that for a moment, because this confuses a lot of people. It actually comes from what we call the geologic timescale. This is used out in the secular world. This comes from the United States Geological Survey, very technical versions. This is kind of a friendly, easy version to follow. Typically, we find dinosaurs in these three rock layers: Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous rock. And so what happens is people find, say, a Triceratops fossil. They go right here into the very middle, and they move over, and they say, that's so many millions of years ago. But I want you to understand that these rock layers come out of a secular worldview. The dates do. Now, we all agree on the rock layers. Creationists, evolutionists, there really is a Cambrian rock layer. There really is a Triassic rock layer. There really is a Cretaceous rock layer. Where we disagree is the timing about how long it took to lay down those rock layers. Like, we're looking at these rock layers thinking, wow, the vast majority of these were laid down during the flood, which was over the course of about a year. But the secular world, remember, they've rejected the Bible. They've thrown the Bible out there. They say there was no major catastrophes, especially no global flood. And they assume those rock layers were laid down slowly and gradually over millions and billions of years. And so that's where the alleged ages of these bones come from. We all agree we find these fossils in here. You come over, it's in this particular layer, but we're looking at it saying, whoa, those dinosaurs are laid down in flood sediment. They're saying, oh no, they were laid down millions of years ago. We're looking at the same evidence. We're looking at the same rock layers, two different interpretations because of two different authorities. So me as a Christian, I look at this and I go, boom, this is flood sediment. So these dinosaur bones that we're finding, that we're digging up, they were buried at the same time that Noah was floating above them, about 4,350 years ago or so. Okay. So in light of a global flood like this, the idea of millions and billions of years just vanishes. Did you notice that? Let me back up one so you can see this. This idea of millions and billions of years is gone in light of the global flood. I don't know if you realize the alleged age of the earth, when they were trying to say, oh, how old is the earth? They were looking at rock layers. They were assuming rock layers were laid down slowly and gradually over millions of years. They'd done the global flood out. But as soon as you have a global flood, the idea of millions of years is gone. It's just gone. So then people ask that question, well, how old is the earth? You know, biblically, if we just start with the Bible, how old is the earth? Now, I've actually done this calculation. I tallied it up. I added up from creation all the way up to the captivity. And the reason I went up to the captivity and just kind of stopped there is everyone pretty much agrees when the captivity of the Israelites was within about 2 years or so, 2 to 3 years, people battled. So I just went to there and I thought it's not worth me adding up everything else. I'll use that as kind of an anchor date. And I was just about 7 years off from Usher. So I really wasn't too far off, and I think Usher was actually better on it. I went back and looked. I'm like, well, why are we? What happened? And there were times where he found a father and a son co-reign, so he had to subtract a year, and I missed things like that. And I'm like, I got all these amazing Bible programs and stuff. And I miss stuff like that. But at any rate, we can do an easy calculation, so you don't have to run through all this. Easy one is God created everything on the first day. God created time on the first day. God is not within time. God is beyond time. So when people ask that question, hey, where'd God come from? Or who created God? They have it wrong. They don't understand who God is because God is outside of time. God created time. He's not bound to his creation. God is the one that caused time to start. He is the unmoved mover. So that's kind of an easy way to answer that. Well, anyway, God created everything beginning on the first day of creation. Adam was created on the sixth day. See, about 5 days in between there. Now, that's almost negligible in our calculation. Now, if you add up the genealogies from Adam to Abraham, now most people can do this. This is in Genesis 5, Genesis chapter 11. You get about 2,000 years. And I got a chart on my website, biblicalauthorityministries.org. If you hop on there, type in how old is the earth, you'll see this pop up. It's actually in a few different articles. And you can just see where the overlaps are. And you get down here to Abraham, which is toward the bottom, about 3 up from the bottom. And it's about 2,000 years after creation. So you have about 2,000 years in there. Now, most scholars, Christian or secular, agree that Abraham lived about 2,000 years before Christ, which is about 4,000 years ago from today. So from a rough estimate, you get about 6,000 years. In fact, this is what most chronologists from Usher to Jones to Clausen to Calmet, host of different people, have arrived at numbers very similar to this. Well, does the Bible talk about any dinosaurs? To get back to the subject of dinosaurs here. Actually, I would suggest the Bible does talk about some dinosaurs. Obviously, you got what he's talking about dinosaurs on day 6 of creation because they're land animals. That would include dinosaurs. But there are a few places that might actually be in reference to some of this. Probably the most popular one is Job chapter 40, verses 15 through 19. Here, I'm going to read this. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. Eats grass like an ox. See now his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze, his ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. And so when you look at this behemoth is some sort of massive creature. It's the first of the chief of the ways of God. And this creature was made alongside Job. This is the Lord speaking to Job, by the way. And so he's talking about this massive creature. He eats grass like an ox. He moves his tail like a cedar. He's the first of the ways of God. Wow, this is some sort of massive creature. Well, there's some Bible commentaries that footnote this behemoth and say, well, maybe this behemoth is an elephant or a hippo. And I thought, really? An elephant or hippo that moves his tail like a cedar? Now, don't you understand, in Bible times, the cedars of Lebanon were known to be some of these massive trees. Here are a few cedar trees that are a bit smaller, but you can just imagine these when they get big and gigantic. I mean, these are massive creatures. Does an elephant or hippo have a tail that moves like a cedar? Here's an elephant. I mean, I've gotten behind elephants and gotten some nice video and some photos of these things. That little tail up there is just kind of whipping around trying to knock insects off its back and so forth. This thing is not moving at all the way a cedar would move. You know, cedars are fairly rigid, and I mean, they really reach out there. What about a hippo? This hippo hardly has a tail. It's got a little flap that just kind of moves like this, you know, and it's like, oh boy, that's not even a comparison here. It just makes no sense. You know, the tail moves more like a cedar or something like this. I've got it kind of bent around to fit on the illustration. Does that work? Nope. What about this one? Nope. You know, it actually fits a creature a little bit more akin to something like a sauropod dinosaur. And so, you know, is it exactly that? We don't know, but that's a great possibility right there in Job chapter 40. Well, the very next chapter, Job 41, the Lord starts talking about a creature called Leviathan. Now, this is a water creature, so technically this is not a dinosaur. But let me read verses 18 through 21 and just kind of get an idea of what we're talking about here. His sneezings flash forth light. His eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning light. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Now, I wonder if in the back of your mind, are you thinking, wow, is this something like a fire-breathing dragon? Boy, it sure sounds something like that, doesn't it? Well, I've had people say, now, hold on a second, Bodie. This behemoth, this Leviathan, they're just mythological creatures. They're not real. And I thought, really? Because the Lord is speaking to Job in Job 38 through 41. He's basically putting Job in his place. And during that time, the Lord talks about a lion, a raven, a goat, a deer, donkey, wild ox, ostrich, horse, locust, hawk, eagle. He's talking about all these real creatures. Why would the Lord mid-sentence suddenly switch to mythological creatures? That doesn't make any sense. It's eating grass like an ox. So it's clearly not an ox. It's this behemoth. You know, it was made right alongside Job here. So, I mean, it's clearly a real creature. But Bodie, the Lord never make a creature like this Leviathan that would shoot out fire. I mean, you got to be kidding me, right? Let me introduce you to a bombardier beetle. Many of you might be familiar with this. They find these beetles all over the world. These little beetles are amazing. They have a little chamber in the back end where it shoots in two different chemicals that essentially ignite with each other, and it shoots it out as a super hot vapor, kind of like a chemical burn to protect itself or to attack something that might be trying to get in. I mean, this is an amazing little thing, and it's quick. You can actually hear it when it goes off. I mean, it's whoa, and it will burn you. Now, it's not the type of fire that's going to burn your house down or burn your village down, but it definitely will burn you. It's an amazing little creature. You know, if the Lord can do this with a bug, can He do this with a Leviathan? Yeah, I don't see there being a problem with that. You know, the Bible talked about other creatures that shot fire too. I consider Isaiah 14 and 30, where it's talking about the fiery flying serpent. Or if you go back to the books of Moses, Numbers and Deuteronomy, it talks about the fiery serpents. So there is something unique to be said about all this. Yeah, I think it's not a problem for the Lord to do this with a Leviathan. Well, why don't we find the word dinosaur in the Bible? You know, this is also an amazing question, and it actually answers real easy when you understand the history of all this. The word dinosaur is actually kind of a new word, and a lot of people don't realize this. So let's look at this historically. You know, early translations of the Bible into English were in the 15 and 1600s. You might think of Tyndale or the Matthew's Bible, the Great Bible. There was a number of different ones, and people were arguing over these. Of course, we had Wycliffe back in the 1300s. That was a translation of the Latin Vulgate. But legitimate translations going all the way back to original languages, that was really in the 1500s. In 1611, we got the King James. That was probably one of the most prominent English translations that's ever been. In fact, a lot of modern translations, one way or another, still have roots and ties that go back to the King James. But the word dinosaur here was not even invented until the year 1841. Sir Richard Owen coined it. And just to give you an idea, that's about 230 years difference. So when we see all these translations of the Bible into English, the word dinosaur wasn't even invented yet. So of course we're not going to find it in there. But was there another word that was used in the Bible that actually did include creatures like dinosaurs? And the answer is yes. It is the word dragons. The word dragon is actually found in the Old Testament quite a few times here. Just in the King James, the Old Testament is 22 times. And the Old Geneva Bible is 24 times. There's a handful of words, tanim, tananim, and so forth. There's a few of them that the translators felt like it needed to be translated as dragon or dragons. And so there's a number of them here. Let's just show you where these are. It's all throughout the Old Testament. It's not like one isolated book or anything like that. You see it from Genesis, Deuteronomy, Nehemiah, Psalm. You see it in the prophets and so forth. So it's in a number of different places here. So let's just look at some specifically. Isaiah 27, verse 1. In that day, the Lord with his sword and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. Here, Leviathan's called a dragon. If you look at Psalm 91:13, thou shalt tread upon the lion and the adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample under feet. This is talking about a land dragon. So it kind of gives you an idea. The word dragon is more of an overarching term, okay? So it would include creatures like dinosaurs. So when it comes to dinosaurs and dragons, sometimes we look at these and we think, wow, they're kind of like a mirror image of each other. Yes and no. This kind of gets the point across, but at the same time, the word dragon, like I said, it's more of an overarching term. It included other creatures besides just dinosaurs. So the word dragon, it included flying reptiles. So your pteranodons and pterodactyls, wyvern type of creatures would all be listed under flying reptiles. Sea reptiles, chronosaur, plesiosaur, those would be listed as dragons. When it comes to land reptiles, even the large serpentine type of snakes, of history, that some that just frightened entire armies, those would be considered dragons, as well as creatures like dinosaurs. So here's kind of an overarching view of the definition of dragon. If you kind of look off to the left side of your screen here, you can see the land dragons, and then it's broken into the dinosaurian and non-dinosaurian. Under dinosaur, you got the two different hip structures for the definition of a dinosaur, but even things like crocodiles under non-dinosaurian, those could actually be considered dragons as well. So yeah, this kind of breaks down, but it kind of gives you an idea of some of the variations within the dragon label anyway. Okay, aren't dragons a myth though? I mean, I was taught this. I don't know how many times, I was told, oh, well, dragons are myth. They're just a myth. Well, there's definitely a lot of shows and fiction and movies out there that have fictional dragons. How to Train Your Dragon, for example, Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potter series, and so forth. They all have dragons, but these dragons, they are clearly mythological. They're just part of storytelling within some of those. But I used to think, boy, this is gonna go back quite a ways. Now, I was actually surprised that this is actually a relatively new change. You go back historically, everybody viewed dragons as real. They were right there listed, right among all sorts of other creatures that were clearly real creatures. In the late 1800s, well, actually in the 1800s, we started to see some people backing off, saying, "Oh, well, maybe dragons are a myth. They're possibly fabulous and so forth," because they didn't see them anymore. So that idea started to get going. In the late 1800s, there's still some places that are saying, hey, dragons are definitely real. It wasn't until about 1910. In 1910 is the first time I actually saw a big public thing come out. This was in the Encyclopedia Britannica in the 11th edition that came out and said, oh, dragons are myth. And the whole reason they finally said that is, well, somebody said there were still some dragons living up in the Alps over in Europe. Somebody went up there. They weren't there. So they said, therefore they're myth. But this idea of animals just going extinct completely escaped people at that time. I don't think people actually thought that animals could go extinct. Meanwhile, tons of different animals have been going extinct. Dodo birds, for example, passenger pigeons have gone extinct. West African rhinos, more recently, they think have gone extinct. Hosts of different animals historically have gone extinct. And so dinosaur dragon-like creatures are no different. A number of people, though, went against this, even though that was in 1910. The New Century Dictionary, this was originally published in 1927. This is a reprint from 1946. It's talking about a dragon, a huge serpent or snake, now rare. But it also gives the next definition, fabulous monster. So, it actually included both definitions. And I found this more recently in another dictionary somewhere around this same time. So you can kind of see that shift that was starting to go on. But historically, people viewed dragons as real creatures. One of the most famous dragon slayers is St. George. St. George slayed a dragon and rescued a princess, actually. When I was over in Gamlestan, it's the old portion of Stockholm, Sweden. They had this huge statue of St. George slaying the dragon. I've been to St. George's Chapel there at Windsor Castle as well. So, I mean, this is a very famous account that's pretty well documented. But yeah, St. George, just to give you an idea, He was a Roman soldier and became a Christian. He was living around AD 300. Just to give you a taste, he rescued this princess, but there's a big long story behind that. But at any rate, he rescued the princess. But Rome wanted him to recant his views, and they later ended up putting him to death because he would not do that. He would still stand with Christ. But dragon legends abound throughout history. We think of places like China and Japan. They're well known for their dragon legends. Europe, all across it, the Middle East. Just in the United Kingdom, each of these towns or villages have at least one dragon legend associated with it, if not more than one. And I've actually been to some of these places. It's just pretty fascinating to see. In England, before the Norman conquest in 1066, the dragon was chief among the royal ensigns in war. When they go out to battle, a lot of times they would take their emblem of a dragon out with them. Even the famous Bayeux Tapestry here. This was done around 1066 when William the Conqueror conquered England. I'm actually a direct descendant of William the Conqueror, by the way, if you just want a little sideline piece of history. But this Bayeux Tapestry, if you look at it carefully, this is just the first portion of a huge tapestry. But you see all these different animals kind of at the top and the bottom of this tapestry as you go along. I mean, these are clearly animals you'd recognize. You get to some that were dragons, right there alongside all these other real creatures. So they viewed dragons as real creatures. Went to Guildhall in Leicester, England. It's kind of in the Midlands of England. And this was the old mayor's chambers and government facility. And as you tour through there, it's been closed for like 400 years. You can still tour it as a historical attraction. And when I went through, you see dragons in various places here, and that was really amazing to be able to see that sort of thing. I love doing that. Went to the Leicestershire Museum and Art Gallery. Now, here's what's significant about this: you actually walk over this to go into the museum. I mean, you got this dragon right here; you couldn't miss it, right? Now, what's fascinating about this is the museum for Alfred Russel Wallace. Many people probably don't know that name. Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin were competing with each other they were both on their way to teaching an evolutionary worldview, and they were battling back and forth, and Darwin basically beat him to it. And that's why you all know Darwin's name. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace was a famous evolutionist in his day, but everybody knows Darwin's name. If Wallace would have beat him to the publications, you'd all know Wallace's name and probably wouldn't know anything about Darwin. But that was his museum. Went to Wissington technically is how this is, but this dragon was done back in the 1300s, and it was in this church. And we had to walk way down the way to get into this church. It's pretty amazing when we got down in there. And you couldn't miss it. There it was. And this dragon apparently was slain not too far from this church. And there was a neighboring church that had the same dragon account of this one being killed at about the same time. But it's a pretty fascinating little creature there. But if you look at even the flag of Wales, it's got the red dragon on there. This is an ancient image of their dragon, even though the flag is more of a modern flag. But I mean, it goes back a long ways. The old Mercian flag of central England had a dragon on it. If you look at the Royal Bavarian flag in southern Germany, you see some lions. Oh, and then you see a dragon on there as well. It's just kind of neat. Like I said, places like Japan and China, they're well known for their dragon legends. You see this a lot in the Far East. In China, the dragon appears as the national symbol and the badge of the royal family. The dragon adorned the Chinese flag until the founding of the Republic of China in 1911. And here's an image of that. That's more the long, slender dragon. And just so you know, the royal family, they were allowed to have a five-toed dragon. All other dragons, you couldn't have five-toed there. Had to be 4 or 3 or so forth. But the royal family was allowed the five-toed dragon. I don't know the history of all that or why it was like that, but that was kind of some of the symbology there. If you've ever been to a Chinese restaurant, they have this 12-year zodiac, a 12-year cycle, and they have animals that represent those different cycles. They have 11 real creatures and suddenly a dragon. And this is an ancient type of a thing that they've done. They viewed the dragon as a real creature. They even have cookbooks and stuff like that, which is fascinating if you want to look those kinds of things up. When I went to South America, I've been down to Peru a couple times, spoken at various universities, at these big creation conferences. A lot of stuff had been translated into Spanish. I love doing that. We got a chance to see a lot of different sites. Flew over the Nazca lines and went up to Machu Picchu and Cusco. And then we went above Cusco up in the mountains. We were over 2 miles high and we're finding all these marine fossils and stuff. But here was something right there at the Museum of the Nation in Lima, Peru. This is from the Machi culture, or Machi. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that, particularly in Old Spanish or even their native language. But this is estimated to be somewhere between AD 400 and 1100, and it's a piece of pottery here that's got a dragon on it. Now, what's interesting is you see all these other creatures on the pottery that you'd readily recognize. You know, oh, yep, that's a puma, or that's a different type of bird, or whatnot. You totally recognize it. In fact, a number of our different guides kept saying, yeah, they only drew things they saw. They only drew things they saw. And you get to something like this, and it's like, yeah, I didn't know what to say, which was interesting. But I've had some people say, now hold on a second, Bodie, dragons. Dragons equal Satan, right? And, when we get to the New Testament, we do see some examples, where, Satan is equated with being the great dragon and so forth. And I think there's a good reason for that analogy. Yes, Satan should be called the great dragon because it's based on some of these dragons that were real creatures and were oftentimes quite vicious. A lot of these old dragon legends we see all over the world, they're pretty vicious. And so that's why there was the hostilities between man and dragons, and man ended up taking out a lot of these dragons. So I think there's a good reason to compare Satan to dragons. But I want you to understand, Satan is also compared to lions. He prowls around like a roaring lion. He's equated with a lot of different things. So we have to be very careful about saying, oh, I don't want to talk about dragons and so forth. That's associated with Satan, because what we're doing in here, we're actually talking about the real animal creature that has gone extinct, that would include creatures like dinosaurs. So if you look at Satan comparisons, yes, dragon, he's equated with the serpent, lion. He's also equated with angel of light. And vipers are his offspring. Remember, you brood of vipers, so forth. Goats were his followers. Even Peter and Judas both had encounters with Satan. When Jesus said to Peter, "Satan, get behind me," and so forth. So, what we have to do though is step back and realize, yes, Satan is evil. Satan is the great dragon and so forth. But in this particular talk, we're talking about the dragons that are the animal creatures, and so that's what I want to be focusing on more in this talk. But I did want to throw this caveat out there. Okay, so why don't we find dinosaurs today? Well, what did the world say? The world said dinosaurs evolved into birds. Yeah, sorry, that's not happening. There it goes. Down he goes. So, yep, crash, bang, boom. There he goes. But the world talks an awful lot about dinosaurs, particularly with feathers. We see it on kids' books. We see it in all sorts of illustrations, whether it's technical journals and so forth. We see an awful lot of dinosaur imagery with feathers on it. We don't actually find? We don't actually find dinosaur fossils with feathers. But that doesn't stop the world from talking about it. In fact, the U.S. Postal Service put out a thing here with T-Rex stamps. I actually got a copy of these. And if you look closely at that very first one, they put, they see the dino fuzz on there. They put proto feathers on a T-Rex. Do we have any evidence of that? No. But you know who they worked with to get these images? They worked with the Smithsonian Institute. And yet, if you go to the Smithsonian, they say T-Rex was likely covered with scales, not feathers, because we find scaly imprints of them. And yet, there's this idea that dinosaurs evolved into birds, so much so that people are trying to intentionally put types of feathers or proto feathers on top of dinosaurs. But if we look out in the fossils, we don't find that. Dr. David Minton, he was a world-renowned anatomist, a brilliant guy, great biologist. Now, I was good friends with Dr. Minton. He was a brilliant guy before he died a few years back now. Now, he's summing up research done by Dr. Alan Fiducia, who is an evolutionist, he and his coworkers. Now, they disagree with the evolutionists that say dinosaurs evolved into birds. Dr. Fiducia and some of his coworkers, they believe a previous reptile evolved into birds, not from the dinosaurs. Nevertheless, he's done a lot of study on the fossils, particularly on this particular subject. And Dr. Minton sums up his research. He says, Fiducia and coworkers have presented a substantial body of evidence to support their view that there are, in fact, no known dinosaurs with feathers. So, to me, that was pretty fascinating and revealing quote. But we're in a culture today where you can hop on the internet and say, hey, find me a dinosaur fossil with feathers on it. And, I do that. And from time to time, I look, but the same major things tend to pop up over and over again. And you get different groupings of things. Let me back up here so you can see this a little better. On the left side, you have micro raptor right there in the middle. On the top, you have an Archaeopteryx, and at the bottom, you have Confuciusornis. You go over to the right side, you see these dinosaur creatures with something that looks kind of like you see something along the back of their neck. So, you've got two different groupings of types of creatures. If you zoom up here to the Archaeopteryx, Now, this is a cast, but you can still see it's got feathers. It is clearly a bird-like creature. There's no doubt about that. Now, I've had people say, well, see, this Archaeopteryx, it has feathers, therefore dinosaurs had feathers. Now, the problem is those are birds. That's all they are. Microraptor, Confucius hornets, they're just birds. When they find feathers on them, they're actually birds, and their features are like that of birds. But remember what's happened. Remember earlier they defined dinosaurs out in the world. Dinosaurs and birds are basically the same thing. So when they see a bird with feathers on it, they say, look, a dinosaur with feathers on it. You see how everything gets convoluted on this, and it doesn't make any sense. Well, let's look at this a little closer, because I want you to understand there's three ways people try to make a missing link. Three. The first is you take birds and you try to make them look like dinosaurs. So in a lot of these artist representations, they take these birds, which are clearly birds, and they try to put reptilian features on them. The second way to make a missing link is you take creatures that are dinosaurs and you try to make them look like birds. You try to put feathers and other types of features on it. That's what happened when they did that T-Rex with the dino fuzz on it. It didn't make any sense, but that's what people are doing. There's no evidence for it, but that's the second way people try to make missing links. The third is that they just end up faking it. So you have to understand there's three ways that people are trying to do this, and they try to justify it. Don't get me wrong, they try to. In this instance, with the dinosaurs being, saying trying to put feathers on it, trying to justify that, they look at the back of the neck and they say, "Hey, look, there's some fibrous looking stuff here. So maybe we can put some dinosaur fuzz, or some of these proto feathers on top of dinosaurs." But no, that's not necessarily the case. A lot of reptiles did have things on the back of their neck. We even see that today. But in some cases, they say, but there's some stuff in there that's kind of fibrous. And when it's fibrous, if you look really close at those fibers, maybe that's proto feather. All right, I'm going to give you a quote. It's probably the most technical quote of the whole talk. This is from Dr. Alan Fiducia and some of his co-workers. Wang, for example. What they said is they're looking at those little fibers. They're saying, hey, these fibers show a striking similarity to the structure and levels of organization of dermal collagen. The proposal that these fibers are protofeathers is dismissed. Now, let me put that into plain English. They're saying those little fibers that you're seeing on those dinosaurs, they're not protofeathers. They're not feathers at all. They actually look like collagen, dermal collagen. That is, collagen is like the glue that holds your tissue and your muscles and things together inside your body. And so as you die and you start to rot and decay, those things become more pronounced. And so that's what you're seeing. They're not protofeathers. It's actually a natural part of a decaying part of the body. So, like I said, third way to make that missing link is to fake it. And, we see people do that. People have been out there doing this. One of them goes all the way back to year 2000. The Archaeoraptor is a very famous fraud. That's different from the Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is a bird. This is Archaeoraptor, just so you're not confused on that. But, if you look at the history of this, the reviewer spotted that this was a fake fossil 3 months in advance. It was published anyway. And then they had to come out and pull the retraction and say, yeah, this isn't a good one. But yeah, we do see that sort of thing. In fact, people are getting better and better at fakes. I mean, I hate to say it, we're in a sinkhurst and broken world. People are going to mess up. Scientific American actually does a quote here based on a Science magazine study. They say an investigative report published in Science in 2010 revealed that as many as 80% of marine reptile fossils on display in Chinese museums had been altered or manipulated. Now, I just want you to understand, it's not like 2 or 3. The 80% of them had been manipulated or altered. See, the point is people are getting better and better at trying to fake these sorts of things, so much so that people have been writing all these technical papers on how to spot the fakes. And, we're seeing more and more of that. Now, we're also in the AI generation. People can type into AI, hey, make me a fossil with some feathers on it. So you just have to be very careful of that sort of thing. Make sure whenever you're looking at any of these, that they really do go through a good, solid peer review process and check these kinds of things out, especially on these types of debatable fossils and so forth that are out there. But at any rate, how do you change the scale into a feather anyway? I mean, we do see a lot of skin imprints of dinosaurs. They were scales, or they had scutes, which is a specialized form of scale, essentially. But they were clearly not feathered creatures. They are scaly types of creatures. How do you change a scale into a feather? They're totally different. They grow different. They're not even remotely similar. Scales are like folds in the skin. They're totally different than, say, a feather, which grows out of a follicle and has this intricate growth pattern with barbules and so forth. Dr. David Minton actually took these pictures, and if you look on the right side, if you look really careful, you can see those barbules, how they actually grow out of there and they attach, and that's what holds feather pieces together. It's an amazing design. But how do you change scales into a feather? Here's a skin imprint. This is a cast, but it's from a hadrosaur. How do you change one into the other? You just can't. When you start looking at these details, it just doesn't make any sense. Now, look at this. This was something that was found back in 2012, published in New Scientist. And I got excited when I first saw these because you see these absolutely gorgeous fossilized feathers. Beautiful. You see the vein, you see it's just, they're gorgeous, right? Now, notice the caption. They look like feathers. The conclusion of this paper was that these are not true feathers. Now, they would look at collagen fibers and they would say, oh, look, feathers, proto feathers. But they look at something like this and they say, no, these are not true feathers. Why would they possibly say that? Here's why. In their story, these feathers were found in rock layers essentially before the dinosaurs. So their response was, well, these can't be true feathers because dinosaurs haven't evolved into birds yet. Oh, so that was their reason. You see the big problems with that? Don't let the evidence get in the way. Those are clearly fossilized feathers, and they were found deeper than the dinosaurs. Now, is that a problem from a biblical viewpoint? No, not at all. Remember, there was a global flood, so we expect to find those sorts of things intermixed in there. So I think that's a brilliant piece of evidence. Here was something else. Theropod dinosaurs were found to eat birds. Now, just so you know, theropod dinosaurs were the ones that supposedly evolved into birds. Now, they find these theropods, and this was published in PLOS ONE, a secular journal. And here it is. If you look at the stomach contents, and you can see there's some stuff that's fossilized. Let's zoom up to that. And you can zoom up and you can kind of see the actual, and then you can kind of see it outlined there on the right side. And they've been able to identify those bones from this last couple of meals here of this dinosaur, and it was from multiple birds. So how is it that theropods are evolving into birds when birds were already around being eaten by theropods? You see, when you start looking at the details of these sorts of things and you start diving into that, you go, oh, wow, it's impossible to change a dinosaur into a bird. Now, from a biblical viewpoint, think about this. Birds were made on day 5, flying and sea creatures. Dinosaurs were made on day 6. So birds were actually around before dinosaurs. So from a biblical viewpoint, we've always known. To the world's defense, I have to admit this, not everyone out there believes dinosaurs evolved into birds. They really don't. A lot of people think some other things that caused extinction. One of the most common is some sort of asteroid or comet or impactor came in, struck the Earth, and killed all the dinosaurs and precious few other things. But that's one of the most popular views. Some people try to mix that now. They say an asteroid came in, killed off just about all of them, and the ones that did survive changed into birds. So they try to kind of mix some of these different views, but there are problems with that. I've seen some technical papers said dinosaurs died of disease. I've seen others said they starved to death. Saw one that said they overate. And then you wouldn't believe this last one, so I have to put the headline up here. Dinosaurs gassed themselves into extinction, British scientists say. And it means exactly what you think it means. Dinosaurs gave off so much flatulence that it affected the climate, and climate change led to the demise of the dinosaurs. So I remember going to my artist at the time, and I said, hey, can you draw this one up for me? And literally, like the first time that I gave this, and I mentioned this one, a kid came up to me out of the audience and said, hey, you draw it like this. And I went to my artist and I said, you know what? I don't think I need any more artwork. This was absolutely brilliant. I love kids. They're absolutely genius on these types of things. But really, is there a mystery? Why are dinosaurs dying out? Why have they died out for all we know? The answer is simple. The ultimate reason is because of sin. When Adam and Eve sinned against God, death and suffering started to rule in this world. Dinosaurs have died out. A host of other animals have died out because of sin, because of death that's been occurring ever since Adam and Eve sinned against God. Now, some of the specific reasons can be changed environment. They could have been hunted by man. Just about every one of those dragon legends out there ended with a dragon getting killed. Diseases, yeah, we leave that open. Genetic problems, catastrophic events. Think of a population of dinosaurs living near a big volcano that goes off and boom, that just wiped out all of them. I mean, those sorts of things can and do happen with some of these catastrophic events. So, is there any evidence out there that confirms that man and dinosaurs lived together? Actually, there's quite a bit. I just want to run through these ever so quickly. These are petroglyphs, cave drawings, etchings, and so forth. Here's one off one of the side canyons of the Grand Canyon called Havasupai Canyons in Arizona. This creature looks surprisingly similar to an Monosaurus. Here's one. This one here stirs up so much controversy. In fact, there's creationists that sometimes want to follow this, sometimes they don't. But clearly, I mean, this looks like a sauropod-like a creature. And when I hear people say, "Oh, well, it's not really that; it's actually a combination of this other stuff," the problem is people don't go to the other petroglyphs and do that to the same thing. You see some things that look like goat or deer or so forth. Nobody goes up to those and say, "Oh, well, it's not really what it looks like." But that's the kind of thing we have to deal with. San Rafael Swell, here's one. This is another one, stirred up controversy with the secular world. And of course, this looks kind of like a flying reptile. At the same time, they want to separate all the parts out, but they don't do that with the other petroglyphs in the area. Here's one up at Lake Superior, up in Ontario, Canada. You can see a boat kind of in the background. You also see something along the back of its neck. And, a lot of dinosaurs had things like that. One of my favorites is over at Carlisle Cathedral in Northern England, although I've never actually been there. I've had some friends go there and shot me some pictures. But uh, Bishop Bell died around the year 1500, and he's buried in the church. And if you go there, it's actually underneath, and there's some brassing all along there. That brassing along the outside edge, if you zoom up to it, has all sorts of animals etched into it. And some of those creatures look just like dinosaurs, which is pretty fascinating. Here's another one down in Australia. The Aborigines had this painted up of a creature that they hunted. They called it Yaru. And the reason they hunted it is it had eaten one of their kinsmen. And it was a water creature, so technical definition, it's not a dinosaur. But you can even see in the drawing here, they drew their kinsman inside the belly and they were trying to hunt it and get him back. Over in Angkor in Cambodia, an ancient temple was rediscovered and they've been cleaning it up. And there's a relief with all sorts of animals all over these temples, actually, the different complex buildings. And here's one that looks kind of like a muzzled stegosaur. And I think they found a second one with some sort of a stegosaur looking creature as well. The Ishtar Gate in Babylon, it's the eighth gate to Babylon, built by order of Nebuchadnezzar. This portions of this have actually survived. It's got this creature and an auric alternating going up this big wall. I actually got a chance to see some of this over at the British Museum when I was there. But look at this. It's got a hip structure, so it raises its body up off the ground. It's got scales. It's got a reptilian tongue. By technical definition, that's a dinosaur right there. When I was looking through Calvin's commentaries, I actually pulled out a hand copy. Nowadays we always look on the internet, if we want to see what different commentaries speak on different issues. In this instance, I actually pulled out the hard copy. And when I pulled it out, I actually stumbled across this artwork for the English translation of John Calvin. It was originally in Latin and then was translated into English. And this was in the year 1578. And this was that artwork. And you can see different animals on it if you actually look kind of close. You see some birds and a pig's head and so forth. But along the top, you see a couple of dragons. See them up here? And we can zoom up to those a little better. You can see those right there along these other real creatures. Down at the bottom middle is a creature. It's upside down, which usually signifies it's dead. But this creature, I put an outline around it because it looks an awful lot like an ornithopod type of dinosaur. Just to give you an idea what an ornithopod looks like, here's one right here. So it's a smaller dinosaur. It's not one of the big ones, but it's kind of fascinating when you see that. If you look at Gilgamesh, he killed this ancient, the ancient Babylonian epic. He killed this huge reptile-like creature. His description is very similar to that of a dinosaur dragon-like creature, and he killed it in the cedar forest. Beowulf, the famous Anglo-Saxon poem. This is maybe 500 years or so after Christ stepped into history and died and resurrected. But this was up in Scandinavian area and I think in Denmark, those areas. And he ends up Beowulf kills this dinosaur-like creature by the way it's described. It's got these small arms but big claws on their reptilian creature. He actually yanked the arm off of it. It fled back to its lair underground near a swamp. And when it gets in there, They went in after and they realized Grendel had a mother, so they killed that as well. But then Beowulf actually died later on fighting a fiery flying serpent, where he slayed it, but he sustained enough injury that he actually died from it as well. In modern times here, actually fairly recent, there were some fascinating finds with red blood cells, partially preserved or at least preserved red blood cells, which shocked everybody. This was research by Dr. Mary Schweitzer. Other people have been able to kind of mimic this and find some things as well. And I know they've taken the lead on this, but they found some uh, preserved red blood cells where they broke a T Rex femur in half. And they got back to the lab and they got in there and they started zooming up and they're like, whoa, what did we just find? And they've done some pretty serious battling in the peer review process. And these are some incredible finds. Now, from a creationist perspective, obviously this makes a lot of sense that these are just a matter of thousands of years old, as opposed to, say, 65 or 66 million years old, which is what the secular world teaches. So, there is that battle. Once again, we're looking at the same evidence. We have different interpretations of that evidence. They've cracked open some more T Rex bones, and they've actually found some soft tissue. This one up here labeled A, you can find a video on the internet of that thing pulling apart. It was actually stretchy. So it's pretty fascinating. It gave off an odor when they smelled it. Here's another one where you see a portion of a vein. I know some creationists cracked open a Triceratops horn. They found much the same. They get in there and they zoomed up with some. It was just amazing research here. Dr. Armitage and Dr. Anderson. And if you look at picture 16, kind of in the middle left here of that, they're actually zoomed up to a vein, and on the inside you can see some of that crystalline material. It's just amazing when you see this type of research. But I love seeing this. A lot of the stuff makes a lot of sense in a lot of a biblical worldview. Okay, so let's do a quick review here to kind of finish this up. Dinosaurs, we just step back, big picture here. Let's zoom back. We just looked at some very fine pieces of evidence, but I want to step back and look big picture. Dinosaurs were made on day 6. Birds were made on day 5. Flying reptiles would have also been made on day 5, like pteranodons and plesiosaurs and so forth. But dinosaurs were made on day 6. They originally ate plants. They were a vegetarian. So was mankind originally. And then we have the fall of mankind. When Adam and Eve sinned against God, everything changed. That's when animals could have first started to eat meat. Whether it was immediate, whether it was more gradual, we simply don't know. We know that snapshot of the fossil record at the flood, there were some dinosaurs and other animals eating other animals. Now, that may well have been a last meal. We simply don't know. But it was definitely after Adam and Eve sinned against God, the death and suffering came into the world. In fact, Adam and Eve were not told that they could eat meat. Well, it wasn't Adam and Eve, but Noah and his family was first permitted to eat meat. Man was first permitted to eat meat in Genesis 9:3 after the flood, by the way. So dinosaurs were on board Noah's Ark, a pair of them. They would have come off the ark as well. But the ones that did not get on the ark died. A lot of them probably rotted, decayed. Others were rapidly buried by sediment-rich water, which seals out the oxygen, makes them candidates for fossilization. They come off the ark, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And as they're multiplying, filling the earth, a lot of them die out. Now, you got to understand there was an ice age that followed the flood. The flood triggered an ice age. Creationists and evolutionists actually agree on that. We just, once again, our timings and so forth. But, how well do reptiles do in the cold? Not as well. Makes sense why mammals thrived. And maybe the numbers for reptiles were diminished, so they could have easily been killed off or hunted, or catastrophes or diseases take out a lot of these. And you get to a point where they faded off, and we don't even find them any longer because they pretty much died out. And then in the 1800s, people start digging up dinosaur bones, and instead of calling them dragon bones, they called them dinosaur, which means terrifying or terrible lizard. It makes you wonder, would there even be a controversy if they just called them dragon bones? It kind of makes you wonder when you look at this. But I want you to just notice here. In this talk, what we did is we tried to step back. We tried to step back and look at dinosaurs in light of what God's word has to say on the subject. We're letting God speak to us, and then we use that framework to answer further and further questions about dinosaurs and dragons in the Bible. But we have to understand, we're in a culture where a lot of people don't believe the Bible. They've bought into the secular worldview, and that's the way they're looking at dinosaurs. So anytime we can give answers to the secular world, when people are asking those questions, you can answer questions about the dinosaurs. Guess what? You can use that as a message to help tell people about the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So as a Christian, how to use dinosaurs? As missionary lizards. I've said this for years and years, and I really want to encourage people to do that. When you start answering questions about dinosaurs, you can talk about the history in the Bible. You can talk about sin and the fall and why we need a Savior. And you can take that conversation. You can point people to the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Through his death, burial, and resurrection, we can be saved. So I want you to understand that's what I'm on about. It's not just about answering the questions. I want to see people won to the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So what kind of resources are there you can get your hands on? There's actually quite a few. I'm just going to tell you about a handful of things. Of course, you can go to my website, biblicalauthorityministries.org. Got a section in there on dinosaurs. If you go to the Q&A section, I've got a book, Dinosaurs, Dragons, in the Bible. And it's an amazing book. You can get it through Master Books. You can get it at a lot of local Christian bookshops, CBD, Answers in Genesis. You can get it at Amazon, probably. I know Walmart was selling it and so forth. There's a lot of different places, maybe not on the shelves, but through their website. I also have a book called Dragons, Legends, and Lore of Dinosaurs. This is more of a family book, kid-friendly. Laura Welch and I put this one together, and this book actually made the top 200 children's books in America when it first came out. So we were pretty excited about this. It's a beautiful book. The artwork was amazing. Bill Looney did an amazing job on this. I also have a book called A Flood of Evidence. Ken Ham and myself put this book together, answering 40 questions. We did 40 chapters, of course, on Noah's Ark and the flood. We did that in honor of 40 days and 40 nights. A lot of questions people have about the flood, how many animals fit on the ark, and so forth. A lot of that geology, and so that really is a powerful piece in there. But hopefully, you guys had a great time with that. And I'm going to try to back out of the screen here, and let's see if and you're probably ready to mute me. You're probably tired of hearing me at this point.
Impossible, Bodie. I feel like you just started. That hour presentation flew by, brother. That was a ton of information. And that in many ways is a go-to video or go-to presentation, answering all things related to the dinosaurs, dragons, and the Bible question. And I love the diversity of topics as well, brother. You had points on the Bible, these fascinating points that perhaps I'll start the Q&A with this, because there's been a lot of interaction in the chat on the very interesting point dealing with the depictions of dinosaur-like creatures and dragons in ancient peoples, in caves and artwork and so on and so forth. And also these historical accounts, for example, with Marco Polo, Alexander the Great. And so excellent presentation on that specific topic for fun, as we always get a mix of critics and non-critics, Bodie, in our live chat. So we do have plenty of critics here.
Yeah.
And so out of curiosity, I posted a question. How do you guys deal with these ancient depictions? And there's been a few different points, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on them, Bodie. Perhaps we can engage them a little bit. One point that they've made, and I've seen this in the past too, made by other anti-young earth creation groups, they'll say, okay, well, perhaps ancient peoples may have found a dinosaur bone or fossil in isolation. Kind of like how, if I remember correctly, some ancient peoples encountered elephant skulls and they misinterpreted the nasal cavity as basically being a single large eye socket. And that's where Cyclops came from. So it's a misinterpretation of a bone, specifically the skull. And so they will say, well, they may have found a bone of a dinosaur in isolation, a fossil, and then imagine what it could have looked like. So not that they seen them in real time, alive, but that they would have had a reconstruction done based on a single bone or skull. And that's what we see in some of these depictions. What would be a good way to interact with that, Bodie?
Well, I mean, I like to hear different things, and that's one of the many things that I've heard over the years as well. For example, in China, they find different dinosaur bones out in some of those areas too. So hey, maybe it's one of these dragon-like creatures. Now, the problem is they have these creatures over and over again right alongside other real creatures. So it's very odd for them to do that, instead of going, oh, okay, well, what's going on here? The other thing that I think is quite fascinating is some of these depictions look surprisingly similar or have descriptions very similar to what we would call dinosaurs.
Right.
So it's almost like you're not finding a bone. You would have to be finding the entire structure of it, putting it together, and actually doing some pretty serious analysis to get it fairly close. Something else that I've always been fascinated by too, like when I was in Leicestershire, um, they have all these wyverns. That's the old dragon of the city, I guess. You know how we have, the state bird of Ohio or the state bird of Kentucky. They have the dragon, right? They have the wyvern. And so you see a lot of images of that. You see it in the cathedral and so forth. Now, what's interesting about that creature is when you look at it, if you just drop the wings off of it, it looks like our short-armed dinosaurs. So, I mean, it's surprisingly similar when you actually look at some of these things. You go, oh, hold it, there might be a connection here more than we think. Our biggest problem, too, though, is we don't know what the dinosaurs really look like. We could be making a lot of mistakes, too.
Right.
When we look at T-Rex or we look at, these sauropod dinosaurs, they may well be a lot more streamlined. They might have had features on them that we don't see because all we're looking at is the bones. I remember talking to Buddy Davis about this many years ago. And, Buddy studied all sorts of dinosaur bones because he built models for these dinosaurs. And of course, you don't know exactly what they were like. But one of the things that we realize is you go back to the early years of the dinosaurs, and everybody wanted to find the biggest and the heaviest dinosaur. If you found a small dinosaur, no one cared. So if you wanted to get published, you wanted to get your name out there, you got to find the big ones. And so what happened is people were finding these dinosaurs and they're like, okay, let's put the bones together. And what they were doing is they were putting a mammalian mass structure on them. Big, chubby looking dinosaurs to add extra weight to say, look, we got the biggest and heaviest that's out here. Now, they're probably dead wrong. Why not use reptilian stuff? It's got reptilian skin imprint type of things. That would make them more streamlined to their skeletal structure and so forth. And with that, there's been people talking about that. Actually, probably the last 20 years, people have been kind of running through that. And they say, you know what, when we start doing this, some of our models look a lot more like the dragons than it does, say, our idea of these big, thick, heavy dinosaur, boo, boo, boo kind of creatures. And so, I still wonder if we're not quite getting our images right. And I wonder if some of these ones of the dragon accounts and the images that they've got, they might actually have been better. But hey, could people go out there and find a dinosaur bone and say, hey, I'm going to build this whole creature? It's kind of far-fetched for them to get that much. And just because you find one big bone, why would you draw a long, slender dragon in China, for example? If you find, just a couple of disarticulated bones here and there, why would you draw something that looks very similar to, say, the dragon or dinosaur like baryonyx, like what we would see or probably interpret from the Beowulf account, so forth. There's a lot more to it than just saying, hey, they saw this and therefore they're coming up with this.
Right.
So
right there are so many excellent points. We know mythologies like Cyclops or Minotaur and the Hydra and all these different creatures. we know they're not real. So if they're depicted, we know that those are myth. But when it comes to these dinosaur depictions, as you're saying, they resemble so closely to what we know about dinosaurs. And so if they find one bone, like you said, too, it'd be hard to believe. It stretches the imagination for them to depict it in such a way that reflects it accurately.
Yeah, and there's something else. I didn't get to talk about this in the talk, but there are some dinosaurs that have been found that actually they use the name dragon for its name.
Right.
There's a couple of them. Dragon of Ken, for example, is one of them. One of my favorite dinosaurs, probably my favorite dinosaurs, is Dracorex hogwartsia.
Yes, that's the one I was thinking of. Yes.
Yeah, it literally means dragon of Hogwarts. When it was unearthed, the Harry Potter movie was out, and they had those dragons flying around. And one of them looks so much like that dinosaur that they just pulled out that they literally named it Dragon of Hogwarts. And I think that's fascinating because now people are starting to draw that connection a little bit more and more. The problem is we disconnected dragons. In our past, we said, oh, dragons are a myth. Oh, now we found all these huge reptilian creatures. Let's name them something else. And people just put them in two different boxes. And it's like, oh boy, we just made a big mistake there.
Right. That's a great point. For those in the audience, if you were to do a quick Google search on Dracorex and just have a look at the way it's depicted, or even just look at the fossil skull, it looks very similar to depictions of dragons in some of our favorite stories and movies, like Smog the Dragon and the way that the head is designed. And so I think there is a disconnect coming from the evolutionary community, and we need to remember those connections there, Bodie. So, those are really great points. From the young earth creationist perspective, it makes sense. We don't need to come up with any far-fetched rescue devices. If man lived with dinosaurs, they saw dinosaurs, so it makes sense that they depicted them in artwork, ancient artwork, and also described them in their journeys, like with Marco Polo, Herodotus, from my understanding, Alexander the Great. And so those are some great points there.
You know, I wrote an article years ago on dragons and dinosaurs and that connection, and I opened it with something interesting. We have a whole bunch of old accounts from sailors that described this bird, and people looked there and they could not find the bird. They just thought, oh man, this must have been a bunch of drunken sailors, but they talked about it for years. All these different sailors were talking about this bird. And they said, it's just a myth. And for a long time, people were like, this is just a mythological bird. It's not true. It's not real. And that was the dodo bird.
Yes.
And lo and behold, in the recesses of a museum in England, they found that somebody had actually stuffed one and brought one back. So then they were like, oh, wow, it's real. And then they go out there and you know, to the island where they were at, and you know, they found some little you know, fossiliferous items from that. But think of that. That's the same sort of thing that's happened here. We've had all these accounts and descriptions of all these dinosaur dragon-like creatures, particularly dragons, I guess. And people are just like, oh, it's just a myth. It's just a myth. Well, now all of a sudden we have all these bones and all this, but people are still wanting to disconnect them. They're simply dragon bones. That's really what they are.
Great points. So the next topic I'd like to discuss a little bit is Behemoth from Job. As we know, there are those outside of the young earth creationist camp, old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists. They really struggle with that depiction of Behemoth and also Leviathan. Right. And a couple different arguments that I've seen. This is an interesting one that I've seen in the past. They really struggle with the tail like a cedar, clearly depicting these massive cedar trees. And that would make sense if it's a sauropod dinosaur or dinosaur in general. But they've looked to one example, an elephant, the wet noodle, but they've compared it to a branch on a cedar tree and how on a windy day that branch may move back and forth. And so to me, that's kind of a stretch, but I'm curious as to your thoughts. Can the tail like a cedar describing Behemoth be referring to a branch on a cedar tree rather than the cedar tree itself?
Okay, so I've sat back and I've just watched elephant tails. It's kind of funny. It's kind of embarrassing. I've been to the Cincinnati Zoo. They got a bunch of these Asian elephants. They're beautiful creatures, but there's 3 places around the pen that you can go to, and everybody congregates where they're looking, where they're eating, and all that. And so here I am on the back side, and I'm back there watching this tail. I've got video of it and stuff. But this tail, it's not moving a little bit. It's not swaying. It's literally whipping up there like a weeping willow. Now, I grew up with weeping willows, and, you know, when the wind's going, I mean, they're just, you know, it's not like a cedar. We also had a cedar tree literally right next to our weeping willow. The way that tail on the elephant is moving, it's whipping around there like a weeping willow, not at all the way our cedar. Our cedars, they're still kind of rigid out here. I mean, you know, if it's a really big storm, but it's not at all the way an elephant tail moves. Now, take note that it's not just saying it's a tail like a cedar, it's a tail that moves like a cedar. And so when you think of, you know, cedar trees, you know, you're thinking of, you know, if it's really windy, it's moving like this. And if you're going to sit there and deal with the branches, well, you could have named any tree in the entire world, and all of a sudden that becomes meaningless.
Right.
Job would be like, oh, what do you mean, Lord? I have no idea what you're talking about. And of course, you know, that's not how Job responded to that, of course. But yeah, I mean, if it's like a branch, a weeping willow is probably the closest thing you'll get when I've seen those things just whipping around like that.
Well, that's a great point. Why choose a cedar tree, if God just wants to emphasize the branch, he
Right.
could have picked any cedar tree rather than being
Or
misleading.
any old branch. Yeah.
Yeah. And from my understanding, without pulling up the text, God describes Behemoth as being no man can approach him with a sword. But if it's an elephant or a hippo, well, from my understanding throughout history, men have hunted
They
dangerous,
have.
sure,
Yeah.
but they've hunted elephants and hippos. They've tamed elephants. We've seen
Mhm.
that. But a sauropod dinosaur, something that more so fits that description, I think would fit with that saying that no man can approach him with a sword.
Yeah, and there's other context too, you know, and I think that's a great point. I think you nailed it on that. But considering, you know, this behemoth, it eats grass like an ox. If you look at an elephant does not eat grass like an ox. It doesn't just
Right.
sit down there and graze. You know, it's ripping stuff off with its trunk and eat. I mean, ox don't eat like an elephant does. You know, so there's a lot of little things like this. This thing, it goes up into the mountains and it comes back, you know, and it's in amongst a flooding river and it has no fear. And this isn't just, you know, sitting in the Jordan River. This is while it's flood stage, while it's going something serious. And of course, you know, the Jordan River today is kind of wimpy, you know, compared to probably what it was in the past when it was a lot more uh, vigorous, you know, because of a lot more rainfall and things like that, possibly going back to those days. So, you know, there's a lot more context when you start looking at that. They go, no, this isn't going to be like an elephant. This isn't going to be, it's definitely not an ox because it's being compared to an ox and it's eating. So there's a lot of things and a lot of factors in there. I know the Leviathan was like that. You know, you couldn't pierce the Leviathan. And, you know, people thought, oh, well, maybe this is a crocodile. You know, I've
Right.
had people try to say that, but people spear crocodiles and shoot those with darts all the time. You know, so I mean, they're clearly different
You
creatures,
got the
and
crocodile hunter, right?
right. But I mean, people would go out there and they would do. I mean, they'd hunt them with bows and stuff like that. So or
Right.
javelins and whatnot.
Those are great points. I've been posed the question on Behemoth or Behemoth. I've seen it pronounced different ways.
Right.
People have posed the question, okay, if this creature really is a sauropod dinosaur, why only emphasize the large tail? Why not the large neck?
Well, I think there's a little bit more to it. If you look in there, you know, it's talking further about some of its other features in there. You know, it's ribs like bars of iron, you know, and so forth. You know, so it is talking about some of the other aspects and elements. He's not talking about all of them. You know, when it comes to Leviathan, you know, it's talking about it shooting out fire and stuff, but it doesn't go through all the other details. What's interesting is when it comes to Leviathan, there are other passages of scripture that talk about Leviathan that give us details that aren't in Job. You know, the Lord gives us what is sufficient. He doesn't have to give us every single detail. This isn't an anatomy book. So
Right.
he's going to give us what we need and we can go from there. The point is, they're real creatures and they are fascinating creatures and they're right alongside these others. And Job recognized and stepped back and go, okay, yeah, Lord, you're the Lord. And I think that got the point across. But the interesting thing is Job lived right alongside these creatures.
Well, that's an important point because Bodie, I've heard, well, these are not real creatures. These are mythical creatures, symbolic of something. But it doesn't make much sense to me that God is telling Job to behold this creature. But by the way, it's a fake creature. It's not a real, it's not something you could
Yeah.
really behold.
Right. I made it alongside you, but it's not real. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
this doesn't make sense of the context in those things. But
And again, this goes back to the biblical starting point, the biblical worldview. These things are not difficult for us to explain. Bodie, you and I are as young Earth creationists. We don't need to invent rescue devices or come up with answers that stretch the imagination like a hippo or an elephant or ancient Near Eastern exegetes. They are interpreting Behemoth as a bull, this super bull. I don't know if you've heard that one.
yeah, well, bull's an ox, which is really weird. You know, hey, it eats grass like an ox. Well, hold it. That means it's not an ox.
Yeah, right.
So
Uh-huh.
it's like, hey, that bird flies like a bird. Oh, well, yeah.
But it's
So
not a
yeah,
bird. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that one. That's a
yeah,
good point that contradicts that theory as well. And so as creationists, we believe the Bible. We start with the Bible. And so man and dinosaurs were created on day 6. And so it's not a surprise that man would describe dinosaurs. Job was able to behold dinosaurs. This fits in nicely. Okay, so I think we dealt with those objections quite well.
Yeah.
You had some good points, Bodie, on and this is a controversial issue, the dinosaur to bird evolution, but also within that world, you have the feathered dinosaur argument. And you made some really good points about how these fibers that they interpret as being proto feathers or feathers in general could actually represent decayed collagen fibers in the decay process. And if I remember correctly, I did a study and put out a video a couple years ago on this topic, so it's been a while. But they've done studies, I think it could have been back in 2018, where they looked at decayed ichthyosaur, and it could have been shark skin. And they had the same looking fibers that you find on these dinosaur fossils. But those, obviously, those creatures don't have feathers. They were decayed collagen fibers. And so my question is this, because I've seen critics push back on that and say, okay, that could be the case, that these are decayed collagen fibers, basically flaring out. But we do find in some instances melanosomes and keratin. And so those two traits or those two discoveries would tell us that it's more than just decayed collagen, that they are proto feathers. What would be a good way to interact with that, Bodie?
Well, first off, keep in mind that it's the evolutionists. There's a lot of evolutionists out there that agree that that is collagen fibers. So, I mean,
Right.
I don't think that's a big debate point. People want to make it a debate point, but it's really not. Keep in mind, Dr. Fiducia and a lot of these guys out there, they're paleo bird experts, and they're saying, hey, these are not anything related to feathers, not just the collagen, but if you read some of their other papers, you know, they point some of that stuff out too. So I think there's a lot more research that needs to be evaluated, even from the evolutionary side, to go, hold on, we got to be very careful about this, you know, because a lot of those little things that you find, you know, residues and things like that, to me, the sheer fact that you're finding it is an argument against an old Earth, number one,
Right. Good
because
point.
if it's 65, 66 million years old, you shouldn't find any of that stuff at all. So the fact that you're finding any of that goes to show you got to question that age of the Earth. And that's really what I want to encourage people to do, because I want you to understand, I've never had an evolutionist come up to me and say, everything evolved from a single-celled organism about 6,000 years ago. There's not one. They have to have millions and billions of years to tuck all that in there. In fact, that's not even enough time, but they want to at least have some sort of time to throw that in there. But in light of a global flood, you have no millions of years. It's just not there. It's gone. And so, you know, that's really where I want to encourage people. Hey, hold on a second here. A lot of these creatures, especially when it comes to, say, like dinosaurs and stuff like that, we don't know all the aspects of what they were made of because they're not around today for us to study. Did they have some of these other features and elements in there? It's possible. You know, so, you know, we also have to look at it from that perspective too, because we don't get a chance to study their live creature bodies today. They might have had some pretty fascinating things in those scales, or some of the features on them that had residue of things that, you know what, maybe birds and other stuff also had that sort of thing. So those are just questions that we don't know because we don't have the actual creature to look at. But you can't just automatically assume, oh yeah, this is bird-like stuff, especially in light of, I still think you got to go back to scripture. God is the authority on all things. Birds were around before dinosaurs. So there's no way dinosaurs evolved into birds. It's just that simple. Now, I know people out in the secular world, they've rejected the Bible. And once again, this is one of the major points that I pointed out in here. If you reject the Bible, by what authority do you look at anything? You're using man's authority, whether it's your own or whether you're appealing to some other man, but you're placing your eternal faith in the ideas of fallible, sinful people. Now, I remember, you know, I had an old friend of mine, Dr. Tommy Mitchell, before he died. He was an evolutionist. He was a diehard evolutionist. And when he actually came to know the Lord Jesus, he was still an evolutionist. So he still argued for evolution for a long time. And, you know, what really had to get him is he had to get back and go, hold on. if an all-knowing God knows all things, well, then God's going to be right when it comes to anything in the Bible.
Amen.
And that's where I want to encourage. I'm not enemies with evolutionists. Believe it or not, I've actually got a lot of evolutionary friends. I actually lived with someone I was in college. We'd chat back and forth and so on. We had a great time. We're not enemies. And so what I want to do is I want to encourage any of the evolutionists that are out there, or anybody who's maybe bought into an old earth, go back and actually reconsider. God, he's an all-knowing God. He knows everything. He created everything perfect. It's our fault the world is broken. It's full of sin. It's full of death. It's full of suffering. We can't do logic right sometimes. We misinterpret things. That's because we're in a sin-cursed and broken world. And I want to encourage you to go back, read the Bible, and actually say, hey, let me just see. Let me just see. Step back and say, let's see what God says on this subject and see if it's valid. And you know what? From God's perspective, it is valid. From our sinful, fallen minds, we may not always come to the right conclusion, but you need to do is step back and go, hold on, I could be wrong. There were times in my past I was dead wrong. Sometimes it's hard to admit, but God's the one that's always right. And I want to encourage you guys to consider that.
Amen. That's a great encouragement. Very important points. And one point you made is so true, that evolutionists oftentimes shoot themselves in the foot when they ask us questions and bring up challenges where they're not even realizing that these preserved biomolecules or collagen or red blood cell fragments or Neanderthal DNA, why are these things preserved in the first place if we go back millions of years, or even with so-called hominin DNA hundreds of thousands of years? Those shouldn't be there. And so they need to be stepping back and asking themselves that question: how are these things preserved? And I've read, Bodie, in the conventional literature, that decayed collagen fibers can actually mimic melanosomes under certain conditions. And if you read on what conditions those are conditions associated with the flood. So if these
Okay.
dinosaurs
I
were
read
buried
that.
rapidly
That's
in the
good.
flood, then there's a debate to be had there. Are those even melanosomes? There's an ongoing debate there. So it's important, as you said, step back, start with the Bible, and what you'll see as you present it on, Bodie, that the science actually confirms or verifies what the Bible says about all things, including origins. And so here's a question from Echoing Erudites. And you touched on a lot of the evidence that would answer this question. So perhaps we can consider an elevator pitch. If you're stuck in an elevator with somebody for a minute or two and they have a question on this, here's the question: what is the best historical evidence, aside from the Bible, that you feel conclusively demonstrates that dragons and dinosaurs interacted with humans? So in other words, if somebody was open-minded and they came to you and they had this question, what would be some of the best pieces of evidence to point them to, Bodie?
Boy, that's a great question. You know what? I think in all my years, I don't think I've ever been asked that question. There's so many good ones to kind of pick from. And the thing is, in isolation, any one thing isn't really going to be, probably the best. Obviously the Bible is the best. I would say probably one of my favorites is the one at Carlisle Cathedral. And that's because, you see a couple of different dinosaurs looking creatures that are in there right alongside other creatures. And this is in an area where they weren't digging up any dinosaur bones. They still had a couple of hundred years before anybody started digging anything like that up. So I think that's a pretty fascinating one. I guess I could have named off quite a few others, but to me, it still comes down to the Bible is the best evidence by far, and anything that we see beyond that is just a good confirmation, and that's just one of many.
And you can also send them this video. You can say, we've got a video with an hour presentation and a section where we address these challenges and questions. And so a lot of questions have come in. I have questions of my own as well on kinds. You spoke about kinds, Bodie.
Mm-hmm.
And skeptics or critics of young earth creation, they'll typically challenge us and say, okay, in light of kinds or separate ancestry, how can we determine what is and what isn't related? Where's this boundary in kinds? Is it that all dogs are unrelated to, let's say, cats or felids, but then what do we do with a creature like hyenas? Bears, are they related to creatures like dogs and cats? Where do we draw this line, Bodie? What would be a good way to engage that challenge?
Right. Well, first off, from a layman's perspective, we oftentimes, give that little rule of thumb. If creatures can interbreed with each other and hybridize offspring, then that's usually a good sign that they're part of the same kind. Just to give you an example, cats. 20 years ago, we were struggling. Was there two different cat kinds? Was there a big cat kind? Was there a small cat kind?
Right.
And then what we had was an instance where, something like a bobcat or something interbred with the bigger cats, and then the bobcat interbred with the smaller cats. And that let us know, hey, they're all part of one kind. So, when it comes to creatures alive today, that's that's actually pretty easy to be able to say, hey, where's those boundaries, where are those boundaries at? And, that's cat kind, dog kind, those are easy, and they're good ones, they're familiar, that people are familiar with. When it comes to elephant kinds and stuff like that, you got mammoths and mastodons that are part of that same kind. And we can look at their cognitum level, their bone structure, and so forth. It's so similar to Asian elephants and African elephants and Nepalese elephants and so forth. But at the same time, those are extinct. Now, like I said, it gets tough. It gets really tough when it comes to extinct creatures, because we're literally looking at bone structures going, are these similar enough? Could these be variations, within that same kind? And, there is a little leeway in that. Now, just so people know, there's an entire field called baraminology. Bara is the Hebrew word for created. So it's the created kind is really what that is. Men means a kind. So it's that Hebrew baramin is that created kind. So there's a whole field of baraminology. I've worked with some experts on some of that, particularly back in the days when we were doing all that research for the Ark Encounter. There was a number of different people that we worked with, because not one person is an expert on, say, the amphibians or the reptiles or the mammals. And there's a lot of these animals that have made it all the way around the world. Hey, does this animal in Africa breed with this animal over here in Alaska? Those are the kinds of questions that we were asking, and sometimes we didn't have some of that data, so you had to kind of do a little bit of guesswork. And of course, when it comes to the extinct creatures, sometimes you've had extinct variations of certain creatures that are gone, and you can't see if they're interbreeding back with each other. But yeah, there's a whole field of study on that, and I want to encourage people to check out some of that research. I probably can't answer all that in just 5 minutes, but there is a lot of researchers that are working on all that, and I want to encourage them in that. Actually, that's a big field of study right now.
Well, it's a great point, and I like that you point to the morphology or anatomy found in fossil species. It becomes difficult even for the evolutionists, because so many times there's been instances. One that comes to mind has to do with the research of Jack Horner, where he suggested that some dinosaurs previously classified as separate species, Bodie, actually turned out to be different growth stages of the same dinosaur species. So at first we had different species, and so several different species, but no, we realized this is the same species, but in different stages of its life.
Right.
And so fossils, bones found in the dirt, really are low quality, low confidence science. With creatures, extant creatures, reproduction is a great first approximation. And we have genetic data for extant creatures. And I like looking to genetic level discontinuities. One big one that they've established in 2024, even further, is the Y chromosomes, Bodie, between humans and chimpanzees. They've got sophisticated Y chromosome sequencing data now. And when you compare overall gene content, size differences, and architecture, the human Y and the chimpanzee Y, which evolutionists say our closest cousin is the chimpanzee, we can supposedly go back to a common ancestor 6 million years ago, they're less than 30% the same. And so I like to argue these kind of discontinuities help us to draw a line of in ancestry and separate kinds, where you've got humans in their own kind, and of course, based on these massive differences, chimpanzees in a separate kind as well.
Yeah, I think that's amazing research. I love that nowadays, we've got genetic research. You go back 100 years ago, people didn't have much of that. That was in its infancy. You go back 500 years ago, people are like, what was that? They can usually, but what I think is fascinating is, people 2,000 years ago could tell the difference between different kinds. And, so it has a lot to do, I think, with the cognitum level. I mean, yeah, we can get some breeding. I mean, you go out there and you see a Chihuahua and you see a Great Dane and you think those are part of the same kind. um, and they are. And that's what's fascinating about it. So you can see some great diversity in things, but sometimes you would never get natural breeding with that. And it's like that
Mm.
even with a lot of wild animals. Some are bigger, some are smaller. Sometimes one animal comes in heat at a different time than another that are even part of the same kind. And as a result of that, you don't see interbreeding, even though they may be living at lines very similar to one another. Sometimes we do see these things hybridize. And I think that shocks zoos when they put creatures together. Oh, these get along good. Let's put them in there together. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, they had a baby. That's where that liger came from. Just so we see those types of situations. It is a fascinating area of research. I know out in the secular world, when it comes to extinct creatures, they struggle with this as well. Um, the way they classify different things. Of course, they do clades nowadays, but back in the older days, they would still separate things. Genus, species, family. A little bit different than what they do today. But there could be times where, on the same continent, they find, say, a sauropod dinosaur grouping down here, some up here millions and millions of years later by their viewpoint. And so they have this as a family and they have this as a family. And so they separate those out and you have two different families. Yet at the same
Mm.
time, they're probably part of the same family. When we look
Right.
at it as biblical creationists, they're all right there. They're just buried in different layers in the flood. But see, you can see how they sometimes would separate out different families where we would put those families together because, once again, we're looking at it from two different worldviews. So there's those little connections as well.
Well, you hinted at it there, and it's a great point that we find a great deal of morphological variation within species of the same kind that even evolutionists would agree with us on. For example, in your domestic dog, you have an incredible amount of variation there. And so that means sometimes there exists more variation within the same species than across species. We see that today, and we can see reproduction. We can do these breeding tests. We have genetics. Well, how do we determine that then in the fossil record? So if you have fossil species with no genetics, no way to see if these creatures could produce viable offspring or offspring in general. So how can you determine or differentiate between things like homology or homoplasy or convergent evolutionists? So evolutionists have these major struggles.
Yeah, I tell you what, that's a great question. I mean, creationists and evolutionists, when it comes to extinct creatures, there's certain things that none of us can seem to get over because we just don't have all the data we wish we could have. I think that would help us out if we did have a few live creatures of those. But that's what happens when it comes to dinosaurs. Sometimes you just have to look at a cognitum level, look at their morphology, and say, hey, yeah, these are close enough. They're similar.
Mhm.
But even then, when it comes to some of that stuff, we also have to take some of those with a grain of salt and be careful because once we start diving into those kinds of things, we're diving into science models.
Right.
And I love science models. Sometimes they can really help explain a lot of things, but at the same time, I want to stand on the authority of the Bible. Science models can change. We see those change all the time, whether they're creationist models, whether they're evolutionary models. So you got to be careful of just holding on to a model and saying, yeah, this is the truth. This is what we got. You better interpret it in light of this one. Sometimes we just got to be careful and don't hold on to those like they're the gospel truth. The gospel truth is the gospel truth.
Amen, brother. So important. I'm curious, Bodie, how do we understand? And there's been some discussion of this in the live chat here. We've had a great live chat the entire time, a lot of good interaction.
Good.
How do we understand on the ark? God sends two of every kind, but how do we understand the difference between clean and unclean? Is God bringing two of every kind, but seven of some or 14 of others? How do we understand that?
Okay, well, the Bible talks later, and then this is Moses as well, because he puts the account down. He explains what clean creatures were. We see that in Leviticus 11. We also see it in Deuteronomy, kind of repeated. So we have an idea of what the clean creatures were. So basically, just default two of each kind, seven of some. I know some people want to argue 14 of some, but there's some different little intricacies in there. I tend to lean towards seven, for some good reasons. It's not worth getting into for here. But nevertheless, you bring seven of those clean. And so even though, we just see a passing comment of seven there in Genesis, later on, since Leviticus and Deuteronomy talk about clean creatures, we can know what those really were. So when it comes to, say, the sheep goat kind, boom, they'd have 7 of those. Cattle, 7 of those. So yeah, we're going to get some of that. One thing that I found interesting too is, the animals went on the ark, a male and its mate, and of course it'd be like that, with the possibility of a male and its mate, for that 7. Of course, one was sacrificed after the flood. Was there one that was a sacrificial animal as possible, left that way? But when they were called off of the ark, a lot of people may not realize when God called them off the ark, he called them off by their families. So there probably were some animals breeding on the ark. I know some people said, oh, well, maybe they were hibernating. Some animals might have. Elephants likely did not go through a full gestation time. They might have been pregnant coming off the ark. But, rabbits may have come off by the hundreds, if you know anything about rabbits. But, yeah, they were called off by their families. So there probably was some breeding for some of the animals while they were on the ark.
And I appreciate that answer. It's very helpful. And if I remember correctly from your presentation, because we also have questions on this, then from the creationist perspective, Bodie, that time period after the flood, we have an ice age, most creationists would hold to. And the reason why we don't really have dinosaurs today, but they would have been taken onto the ark, were due to many reasons. Environment, I think you said, was one of them. Environmental change. Humans killed off a lot of dinosaurs. I mean, who wants to live next door to a T-Rex? and perhaps that's where a lot of these legends could, yeah, exactly. That would be kind of cool, actually. and perhaps that's where a lot of these legends come into play. These knights in shining armor defeating the dragon. Perhaps that was an embellishment of a situation after the flood where man was killing T-Rex. And so I also found it funny in your presentation where all the different theories that evolutionists have come up with. And one of them, correct me if I'm wrong, was due to gas. Dinosaurs producing too much gas. That's pretty wild, brother.
Yeah. Well, we're in a culture today where they're saying cows are producing too much gas. It's going to lead to climate change. We're all going to die.
Right.
So, yeah, we get some of that. It's interesting too, though. Yeah, a lot of the dinosaur numbers probably were reduced by Ice Age. They probably were hunted. One of the things that I noticed when I was looking at dragon accounts historically, I mean, we actually saw quite a few going all the way up to about the 1500s. After the 1500s, they really start to decline. By the 1800s, there's only a few, and by the 1900s, I mean, you don't find anything. I mean, it almost seems like, yeah, the numbers were reduced and people will comment on it because they're so rare to see. But after the 1500s, they've just dropped off. And I've always wondered, is there a correlation? Is there a reason for that? I mean, yeah, we do have much better guns, number one. So, I mean, that's a possibility. So people are much more efficient, basically, at killing off a lot of creatures, not just dinosaurs, but other things as well. The other thing that I realized, a lot of these old dragon legends, the dragon lived in or near or around a swamp.
Okay.
Now, what's happened since the last 500 years all over the world? People have drained swamps like they're going out of style to turn them into farm ground, turn them into anything else. Chicago used to be a swamp, right? I mean, it's a big city now. So it wouldn't surprise me if they actually were destroying massive amounts of the last habitat that the dinosaurs or dragon, I guess, creatures here could have been surviving in. So it wouldn't surprise me if that was one of the major reasons as well.
Wow,
Just a thought.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you presented on it. It might have been in another presentation or this one. There's a lot of great information in this one that in the dictionary, not that long ago, dragon was now rare.
Yes. Yeah, that was in this one. And I found another dictionary recently that had the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, yeah, okay. But it shows that shift. People viewed them as real. We're not seeing them anymore. Maybe they're a myth. Maybe they're just rare now. Maybe they're they just didn't know. And so as a result, boom, next thing you know, people are just like, it's a myth. It's a myth. It's a myth.
Well, I think we have enough evidence with everything that you've discussed, including dragons being represented. Is it the Chinese calendar where you have all these real animals and then a dragon? So apparently, according to the evolutionists, the dragon is myth, but every other animal is real. And these historical accounts, everything that you presented on, Bodie, I think there's enough there to give us good reason to believe that man and dinosaurs coexisted. Now, one of the largest challenges, one of the biggest challenges that evolutionists will put forth, or anti-young earth creationists, they'll say, okay, well, if man and dinosaur coexisted and man lived alongside dinosaurs, why don't we find dinosaurs and humans buried together in the flood layers, in the rocks? Bodie, what's a good response to that?
I wrote a whole chapter on that. And I also have an article on my website dealing just with that subject. But here's the easy answer. We also don't find humans buried with crocodiles. We also don't find humans buried with coelacanths, which are alive today.
Yeah.
There's this misconception out there that people think, oh, there's this massive number of dinosaur fossils. There really isn't. There's like maybe 30 what we would consider complete T-Rexes, and maybe 60 or so, if you start counting disarticulated things. When it comes to Stegosaurus, if I remember right, it's just a handful. There's not very many. The odds of a human being buried with any of these are outrageous. But, there was a T-Rex that was found buried with a parrot jaw. And that was published in a peer review. People could not believe it. They defended it. And it was right there. But here's what they did. So you have this T-Rex and you have this parrot jaw buried together. And so what they did is they basically drew a line right between the two and said, this is modern, this is old. And that's really what happens. See, a lot of people don't understand the way that they classify some of these rock layers. Like, let's say, for example, you look at these different index fossils of something that say Permian. There's no dinosaurs in it. It's Permian, boom, it's Permian all the way out. And all of a sudden they're digging, and they find a dinosaur in it. Here's what they do. They don't say, hey, look, we found a dinosaur in Permian. They redefine that layer as being Cretaceous, Jurassic, or Cretaceous, Jurassic, or Triassic. So that whole layer gets redefined as soon as you find a dinosaur in it. So you'll never find a dinosaur in any other layer because that layer will be redefined as one of those 3 dinosaur layers. So there's that. But the point is, I wouldn't expect to find humans and dinosaurs buried together. First off, I don't think there was a very big population.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we started with 2 people. We weren't like the animals. God created the world animal rich.
Yes.
We started with 2 people. There's only 10 generations from Adam to Noah. And some of these people, like Noah, he didn't have any children until he's 500 years old. I don't think there's a whole lot of people. And on top of that, we have a 120-year countdown where people were downright evil, vicious, violent. Every thought of every person was evil all the time. I mean, that's terrible. If everybody on Earth was a murderer, the population cuts in half in one day. Wow. I don't think there was a whole lot of people, number one. So the odds of a human being buried with a dinosaur is actually going to be extremely, extremely rare. Like let's say there's a global flood right now. Like, boom, all of a sudden everybody's, oh, look, there's a lion. I'm going to get buried with you. And you go, hold on to, I mean, people probably weren't doing that during the flood anyway. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of good reasons for it. And, people can hop on the website, biblicalauthorityministries.org, and find that article on that if they want to find out some more details.
Well, that right there is what I call a clip-worthy answer. We do like to make clips, shorter clips of our longer videos, and that right there could be a clip that we'll release answering that question, because you made so many important points. From my understanding, they say coelacanth was extinct for somewhere between 65 and 70 million years. But yeah, we find, and you mentioned coelacanth, we find coelacanth swimming around today in the oceans, which mm-hmm. means they live with whales. They coexist with humans. Why don't we find coelacanths and whales? They live in the same environments in the ocean. Why don't we find them buried together?
Right.
Or humans and coelacanths? Because the critic would probably say, well, because coelacanth exists in the water, humans on land. Okay, what about whales? What about other creatures that we should have found them buried with? So that right there is a really good point.
Yeah, and all those fossil layers, they all have marine organisms in it. They all have fish. Yes. I mean, it's clearly a marine catastrophe. So,
and another point you made, and I agree with you, because I've thought the same thing, that, okay, God, according to Genesis, creates 2 people, Adam and Eve, but he doesn't just create 2 of every kind of animal. He creates populations of animals globally in fully working and fully functioning ecosystems. Then you have a couple thousand years where those animals are speciating and varying and adapting. And then at the flood, okay, humans could have existed in a smaller population, like you said, the every thought of every man was wicked. The world was full of violence. Do you have an estimate? I know it's kind of a tough question, but do you have an idea about how large the population may have been at the flood of humans?
It's interesting. A number of creationists have put out estimates. And in that chapter that I did, in that article that's on the website, I actually give some of those estimates. And I think all those estimates are actually quite high. I don't know, just underneath it all, I really think that the population was extremely low. And I think, even when it comes to, say, children, whenever you look at evil cultures around the world and terrible things that they do, the children usually get the brunt of it right off the bat. So it wouldn't surprise me if the population decline was not only steep for that 120-year countdown, but by the time you get to the end, it was probably extremely low. I don't know. It could have been hundreds. It could have been thousands. Some people want to put it in the millions. Some people, even want to put it in the billions, using some modern growth rates and stuff. But I still think the numbers have been very low.
I agree with you. I find it difficult to see that humans would be in the millions or billions in light of the way the pre-flood world was. Hundreds to thousands, tens of thousands, maybe. But the important point to consider, then, you have millions of different species of animals all over the globe, but then you have a very small population of humans. Do you believe they also would have been geographically isolated rather than being spread out, Bodie, in the pre-flood world, do you think?
That's a great question. We know that they did have cities like the city of Enoch. At the same time, people probably were spreading out. Because they weren't judged with like a language split. That's what God does. When He wants to split up the population, He gives them a language split.
Right.
So it wouldn't surprise me if you had pockets in certain areas, but then other areas could have been much more spread out than we might think. So I'd leave both those options open, really.
Which means, all of these things considered, in many ways, it would be like finding a needle in a haystack when it comes to finding a pre-flood human in the rock record, probably then.
Yeah, probably easier to find that needle.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's fallacious reasoning then, I think, from the skeptics.
Yeah.
With these
fossils. And something else that a lot of people don't realize, the flood sediment's massive. It's all over the globe. I think they estimate 700, I can't remember, cubic kilometers or 1.86 million cubic miles or something. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. I put it in that article. But we've only sifted through, if the numbers are correct, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2% of it. Now, that might give us a good idea of what all's out there. It's a good distribution. But at the same time, we've not gone through it all. If people really were living in a handful of cities and those are what got buried and destroyed, we may not have found it yet, number one. But at the same time, one of the things that we find when it comes to, mammals or birds, we find far fewer of those. And when we do find them, they're higher and usually more disarticulated. The reason for that is their buoyancy. They, in a flood, they tend to float. They tend to be higher. They're not going to get buried as easily, like, say, amphibians or reptiles or the stuff at the bottom of the ocean, for example. So there's going to be a less possibility of those things being fossilized. Humans have a physiology of mammals in the sense that we would tend to float. So that means more people during the flood probably would have rotted, decayed. And humans are smart too. They're going to hold on to driftwood. They're going to do what they can to try to survive for as long as they can. By the 150 a day, that was over with, though. But unless they're actually buried, with a unique condition, they're not going to be fossilized. So there's good reasons why we see a little variation within those rock layers. Anyway, the natural sorting power of water, the buoyancy effect, and so forth.
Excellent responses, Bodie. This has been a ton of fun. We have a lot of positive feedback from the live chat. Appreciate all the comments and interaction. We still have over 60 enjoying this live with us.
Wonderful.
Honesty Angel says this has been a really great presentation in Q&A. I hope Bodie will be back in the future for another. Yeah, that would be great. You focus on a lot of good.
Well, I don't have a DeLorean.
Yeah, right. And Apologetics 101 says, great discussion, Donnie. So let's start to wind down with this, because I really want to get this in. I think this would make a good clip too, Bodie, because you've done a lot of work, a lot of really good work on the Tower of Babel. Or Babel, Babel. What's the proper way? I've heard it pronounced both
Yes.
ways. Yes, there you go.
Actually,
Which
Webster
one's
does allow
correct?
us to say
Yes.
it both ways.
So here's the question. As you know, critics, skeptics of the Bible and young earth creation, they attack the Tower of Babel story and account. They say there's no evidence for it's not a real event, it's myth. Even some theistic evolutionists might say that it's symbolic of some kind, allegorical in some way. And so is there evidence for the Tower of Babel event? Can we be confident that that account in the Bible is true, Bodie?
There's actually been a massive amount of evidence for it. And a lot of people don't realize this because the majority of the archaeological study on the city of Babel and the ruins of the Tower of Babel and at least the platforms up underneath and what's been left has actually been done by the Germans. And so they've been publishing for 100 years in German. And so a lot of English speakers are like, huh, what? Just recently, Professor Andrew George uh, he's from the University of London, as I recall. He did a big long technical paper, basically catching us English speakers up on a lot of the finds and things that's been going on in archaeological Babel. And they find a lot of foundation stones, a lot of ancient inscriptions, and so forth. They've actually found 3 different platforms at the site of the Etymon, which is the site that in the native language basically means tower from heaven to earth. You can see reflection of that. And, so we've got a lot of historical documentation, about at least some of those towers and their size. It goes through a lot of iterations and things. So, yeah, we have a lot of history of that. It was finally torn down by Alexander the Great. We have actually historical records of that. He wanted to rebuild it, but he died early, so it wasn't rebuilt. So there's actually quite a bit. Nebuchadnezzar's day, he actually had it refinished probably to its biggest glory. Before that, Sennacherib actually had it destroyed. His son rebuilt it. But we actually have history going all the way back to Hammurabi's day and even before. So it really there's a lot of stuff in there. I wrote a massive long article on the history and archaeology of the Tower of Babel on the website. BiblicalAuthorityMinistries.org. Just type in Babylon. It'd probably be the main article that pops up. I've also written an article on the Tower of Babel, its cultural history, and I've written an entire book on the Tower of Babel and the cultural history and the people groups and so forth. There's a lot there. That's just a sound bite for how much you can actually get out of this.
That's what we're looking for, brother. A good sound bite. And you met that need. We got a good sound bite. Here's your book. Here in the live chat for people to check out Tower of Babel. And we've also got your book here, Dinosaurs, Dragons, and the Bible. The truth about dinosaurs and dragons in the Bible might just blow your mind, Bodie. So I think people's minds have been blown here tonight.
Wonderful.
And I've also got a link to your website in the description box. So I do really want to encourage people to check that out, rewatch this program, share it around to your friends and your family, as this information is so important. There's nothing more important than salvation. Where will you spend eternity? Bodie, I got to say, you are an encyclopedia worth of information. We've discussed a variety of topics tonight, and this has been an excellent program. And so what I want to do, Bodie, is hand it to you for any final words, final thoughts, anything you want to leave myself with and the audience with. This has been a great program. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you. I know we talked a lot about dinosaurs, Tower of Babel, whatever the subject might be. And I know I've touched on the death and suffering issue. But, I think a lot of people out there, that's one of the biggest stickler points for them, saying, hey, I don't know if I want to trust a God who made the world like this. And if they may have missed it in this talk, God actually did make the world perfect. We see that in Genesis 1:31. God declared everything very good. Deuteronomy 32:4 says every work of God is perfect. We expected a perfect creation from a perfect God. And that's what he made. He made a perfect creation and presented it to Adam and Eve. But the problem is when they sinned against God, God cursed the ground, cursed the animals, God cursed the ground, cursed the animals, and sentenced man to die. The world went from a perfect state to an imperfect and broken state. And that's the world we live in. And that's why we see suffering. That's why we see death. We see horrible things that happen, broken relationships, you name it. But I want people to understand that Christ loved us so much that he stepped into history and died for us. He died in our place. And I want people to understand when Christ died on that cross, he took the punishment that we deserve. Now, understand what that punishment was. The punishment we deserve from an infinite and eternal God is an infinite and eternal punishment. Jesus Christ, who is God, the second person of the triune God, stepped into history. And when he died on the cross, the infinite Son took the infinite punishment from the infinite Father. And that was enough to satisfy God's wrath on sin. That's what makes salvation possible. Through his death, burial, and his resurrection, when he resurrected, he showed that he had power over life and death. And the perfection of Christ then can be imputed, that is transferred to us. So when we stand before God on Judgment Day, when God looks at us, he doesn't see us as sinners. He sees the righteousness of Christ on us. What a wonderful and amazing God. That's the kind of God that we should all want to serve. That's what I want to leave you with right there. And if you've not considered this, I want you to consider the claims of Jesus Christ.
Wow. Amen, brother. I really appreciate you presenting the gospel. Nothing more important than salvation. We could win arguments and answer challenges all day, but it's about winning souls. It's about bringing people the gospel message. And so I pray that any skeptics, any critics out there, I appreciate all the critics that have been here in our live chat. We've gotten dozens and dozens of comments and challenges and objections, and we've done our best here tonight to address those in a sophisticated manner. But we do pray that you consider this information and that you consider the gospel, because again, Bodie, there's nothing more important than the question, where and how will you spend eternity? To our brothers and sisters, our fellow Christians in the live chat, we pray that this has been a blessing and that we've strengthened your faith in many ways. And so, Bodie Hodge, God bless you. I appreciate all the work that you've done. Again, I want to encourage those in the audience to check the description box of this video for the relevant link, specifically a link to Bodie's website where you can check out all these different articles and resources and benefit from them. And so, okay, Bodie, thanks so much for doing this. To the audience, I appreciate you all tuning in. Thank you for the interaction, the questions, the comments, the feedback. God bless you. And Standing for Truth is signing out.